Random House Audiobooks presents The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes. Read for you by the author.
The Fatal Shore. In 1787, the 28th year of the reign of King George III, the British government sent a fleet to colonise Australia. Never had a colony been founded so far from its parent state, or in such ignorance of the land that it occupied. There had been no reconnaissance. In 1770, Captain James Cook had made landfall on the unexplored east coast of this utterly enigmatic continent, stopped for a short while at a place called Botany Bay, and gone north again. Since then, no ship had called. Not a word, not an observation for 17 years, each one of which was exactly like the thousands that had preceded it, locked in its prehistoric immensity of blue heat, bush, sandstone, and the measured booming of glassy Pacific rollers. Now this coast was to witness a new colonial experiment, never tried before, not repeated since. An unexplored continent would become a jail. The space around it, the very air and sea, the whole transparent labyrinth of the South Pacific would become a wall 14,000 miles thick. The late 18th century had abounded in schemes of social goodness thrown off by its burgeoning sense of revolution. But here the process was to be reversed, not utopia, but dystopia. Not Rousseau's natural man moving in moral grace among free social contracts, but man coerced, exiled, deracinated, in chains. Other parts of the Pacific, especially Tahiti, might seem to confirm Rousseau's ideas. But the intellectual patrons of Australia in its first colonial years were Thomas Hobbes and the Marquis de Sade. In their most sanguine moments, the authorities hoped that it would eventually swallow a whole class, the criminal class, whose existence was one of the prime sociological beliefs of late Georgian and early Victorian England. Australia was settled to defend English property not from the frog-eating invader across the Channel, but from the marauder within. English lawmakers wished not only to get rid of the criminal class, but if possible to forget about it. Australia was a cloaca, invisible, its contents filthy and unnameable. Jeremy Bentham, inveighing against the thief colony in 1812, argued that transportation, as he put it, was indeed a measure of experiment, but the subject matter of experiment was in this case a peculiarly commodious one, a set of animae viles, a sort of excrementitious mass that could be projected and accordingly was projected as it should seem purposely, as far out of sight as possible. To most Englishmen, this place seemed not just a mutant society, but another planet, an exiled world, summed up in its popular name, Botany Bay. It was remote and anomalous to its white creators. It was strange but close, as the unconscious is to the conscious mind. There was, as yet, no such thing as Australian history or culture. For its first 40 years, everything that happened in the thief colony was English. In the whole period of convict transportation, the Crown shipped more than 160,000 men, women and children, due to defects in the records, the true number will never be precisely known, in bondage to Australia. This was the largest forced exile of citizens at the behest of a European government in pre-modern history. Nothing in earlier penology compares with it. In Australia, England drew the sketch for our own century's vaster and more terrible fresco of repression, the Gulag. No other country had such a birth, and its pangs may be said to have begun on the afternoon of January 26, 1788, when a fleet of 11 vessels carrying 1,030 people, including 548 male and 188 female convicts, under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip in his flagship, the Sirius, entered Port Jackson, or, as it would presently be called, Sydney Harbour.
The poor in Georgian England lived in hopeless squalor on the edge of starvation. Adults and children were ravished by poor working conditions and the attendant occupational diseases. Upper-class fear of the mob supported belief in a rapidly swelling crime wave, a result we now understand of the stresses of industrialization, the growth of towns, and a soaring birth rate. No mechanism existed to supply effective relief of mass unemployment. Crime flourished, unchecked by criminal investigative tools we take for granted today. Prison was seen not as a place of reform, but as a breeding ground for more intense criminality. For some time, transportation, forced exile in plain English, had been seen as a desirable alternative. After 1775, the American colonies rebelled and passed resolutions against accepting England's convicts. Without the American outlet, English prisons soon filled to overflowing. As an uneasy compromise, the government began housing prisoners on the infamous hulks, old troop transports and men of war that stood rotting at anchor. Here, convicts languished until the government could decide where to send them. In 1786, the decision was made to transport the convicts to Australia, which had been claimed for England by Captain James Cook in 1770 as New South Wales. The first expedition to Botany Bay reached the other side of the world utterly unprepared for the task that lay ahead.
The First Fleet had a motley crew, this Noah's Ark of small-time criminality, and for all the trades represented aboard, it was absurdly ill-chosen for the task of colonising New South Wales. The authorities had used no criteria of selection apart from youth, and that erratically. There was no choice by trade. The colony that would have to raise its own crops in unknown soil had only one professional gardener, and he was a raw youth of 20. It would need tons of fish, but it had only one fisherman. There were only 2 brickmakers, 2 bricklayers and a mason for all the houses that would need building. No sawyers were aboard, and only 6 carpenters. Everything they had been told about Botany Bay, even the testimony of Cook's log, was wrong. They'd expected grassland with deep black soil and well-spaced trees where crops could be planted without clearing, an ample source of building stone, a protected anchorage. But what they saw was a flat heath of paperbark scrub and grey-green eucalypts stretching featurelessly away under the grinding white light of that Australian summer. The dry, buzzing monotony of the landscape did not match Cook's account. The bay was open and unprotected, and the Pacific rollers gave it a violent, persistent swell. The water was shallow, the holding ground poor. They all lived for 5 years on the bleak edge of starvation. The first crops failed, and the whole harvest of the second planting, a meagre 40 bushels, had to be saved for seed. In 1788, the convicts had no draft animals, and no plough would be used in Australia until 1803. Wherever new settlements were made, whatever fields were broken, English settlement in Australia rested on its convicts. We must now look more closely at these reluctant pioneers. The pronouncement of sentence was brief. It is therefore ordered and adjudged by this court that you be transported upon the seas, beyond the seas, to such place as His Majesty, by advice of his Privy Council, shall think fit to direct and appoint for the term of your natural life. Or 7 years, or 14. In any case, the shock of sentencing was dreadful. In law, 7 years' banishment meant what it said, but what man could be certain of returning to England at the end of it? For many people, the sentence of transportation, whatever its announced length, must have seemed like a one-way trip over the edge of the world. A man could bear it with dignity in the dock, but despair followed soon after. Anguish shows in the few surviving letters, like this one from a Lancashire weaver named Thomas Holden, who in the course of struggling for his rights as an early trade unionist was convicted in 1812 of administering an illegal oath to one Isaac Crompton in Bolton, Lancashire. It seems probable that Holden was a Luddite. He was also happily married. Dear wife, he wrote from a cell in Lancaster Castle, it's with sorrow that I have to acquaint you that I this day received my trial and have received the hard sentence of 7 years' transportation beyond the seas. If I was for any time in prison, I would try and content myself. But to be sent from my native country, perhaps never to see it again, distresses me beyond comprehension and will terminate my life. To part with my dear wife and child, parents and friends, to be no more, cut off in the bloom of my youth without doing the least wrong to any person on earth. Oh, my hard fate, may God have mercy on me, your affectionate husband until death. In April 1831, Peter Withers, a protester from Wiltshire, wrote from the convict ship Proteus at Spithead to his wife Mary Ann. My dear wife, believe me, my heart is almost broken to think that I must leave you behind. Oh, my dear, what shall I do? I am almost distracted at the thoughts of parting from you whom I do love so dear. Believe me, my dear, it cuts me even to the heart, and my dear wife, there is a ship come to Portsmouth Harbour to take us to New South Wales. Inconceivable distances loom before Withers, who has never been as far from home even as London, and he tries to explain them, to normalise them by promising a fidelity which will annihilate separation. It is about 4 months' sail to that country, but we shall stop at several countries before we gets there for fresh water. I expect you'll hear from me in the course of 9 months. You may depend upon my keeping myself from all other woman, for I shall never let no other run into my mind, for it is only you, my dear, that can ease me of my desire. It is not leaving old England that grieves me, it's leaving my dear and loving wife and children. May God be merciful to me. Many prisoners hoped their wives would go into Australian exile with them, though few actually did. It was hard to get passage out there, and tickets were far beyond the means of a worker's wife. I hope you will strain your utmost to keep my company, Thomas Holden wrote to his wife Molly as he was leaving for the hulks, and not let me go without you, for with your company I don't mind where I go, nor what I suffer, if I have your company to cheer my almost broken heart. And later from the hulk he writes, my sorrow is greatly increased by parting with you. What comfort could I enjoy while we're separate? I could wish to know if you think you could raise money to pay your passage and go with me. She did not go. Neither did Mary Ann, Peter Withers's wife, despite his heart-wringing pleas. There was no reply, and 2 years later Withers was writing to his brothers from Van Diemen's Land, I have sent 2 letters to my wife and can't get any answer from her, which causeth me a great deal of unhappiness, for I think she has quite forgotten me, and I think she has got married to some other man. If she is, pray send me word. But there was still no word from her, and 11 years would pass before Mary Ann wrote in distress to her husband in Van Diemen's Land, asking to be reconciled. She received the news that Peter had married again. There was no question of divorce for the lower classes. One simply relied on the inaccessibility of records and married bigamously. Married to a steady, virtuous woman. I have no property of my own, but my wife has property which she will have in the course of 2 years, he wrote to her. And then we have agreed to help you and the children if God spares our lives. I know that to hear that I'm married is a hard trial for you to bear, but it's no good to tell you a lie. I sent a great many letters before I took a wife. So not hearing from you, I being a young man, I thought it would be a proper thing to look for a partner which would be a comfort to me in my bondage. I sent for you to come out to this country when I came first, and if you had, you would have got me out of bondage for nothing, for a wife could get a release for her husband. So we must not think about coming together again. Poor repentant Mary kept trying. The last news of her is a curt form letter from the Colonial Secretary's office in Whitehall, dated August 1847, telling her that he was living on the 30th of September 1846, but that no further information can be given respecting him. There must have been many variations on this small colonial drama. The Privy Council records contain hundreds of letters from wives asking to go into Australian exile with their husbands. The determination of some of these women was heroic. They yearned for their men, and they would not accept the common fate of abandonment. Jane Eastwood, the 30-year-old wife of a transported Manchester bootmaker, told the Home Secretary Peel in April 1830 that her husband has written several letters to me from Sydney requesting me to apply to government in order to be sent out there to him. I'm determined to go out to my husband, even at the risk of my life. She implores the Home Secretary to put it in my power to become happy by uniting me to the best of husbands, prevent me from the shame of casting myself and child upon the parish for relief, as work is not only scarce, but so ill paid, for that it is utterly out of my power to gain a living for myself and child, and I have no other thing to depend upon except what I can earn by my needle in dress and stay-making. She cannot wait for more letters across the vast Antipodean time lag. She will pay her own fare with whatever she has. I know not how to get over the time until word come back from him, about 9 months at least. I would rather sell my household furniture, which will amount to about £6 or £8. This sum I will most willingly give to government to lessen their expenses of sending me out to Sydney, provided they would be graciously pleased to send me by the first ship. She knows her skills, joined to his, will keep them without government support once she's there. I myself have been thoroughly bred to the dressmaking business and have wrought for years at the umbrella business. I can also bind shoes and boots and can render him every assistance. There can hardly remain a doubt that we would all become a burden upon this colony, but rather a gain to them. This time the government listened, and to Australia she went. Husbands and lovers were also sons, and in an age when family ties across the generations were the very mortar of society, the misery felt by the parents of a transported man, and the shame that he felt for them, could be unbearable. From his unhappy situation in York Castle, awaiting transfer to the hulks, Richard Taylor tells his father, "I wish I had taken your advice. I listened to my fellow prisoners till my heart goes as cold as clay." But no letter comes from his father, and Taylor, fearing that he has been spurned and forgotten, writes in agitation to his uncles, "You must let my father know I am very well, and he must think as little about me as he can, for I am quite innocent, and I hope God will be merciful to me, and I shall see you all again. But if not, I must live for a better world. For my part, I am determined to live a godly life." He invokes the future, trying to shore up the spirits of his parents. He writes from York in May 1840 that "the prayers of a sincere heart are as acceptable to God from the dreary prison as from the splendid palace. What a blessing that assurance is to a poor unfortunate mortal in my hapless condition. He promises reunion. When I have lived out my 10 years in a far distant land, how happy I shall be to return to my native home, and with how much more delight will I return home if God shall spare my dear father until that time, that we may once more meet in the flesh and convene together about heavenly things. Why, my dear parent, if he spare us both to enjoy that happiness, it will be like a foretaste of heaven itself." Such utterances were sincere, but they hardly masked the deeper fear that transportation would sunder the family forever. Some convicts clung to the hope of a last-minute pardon, usually in vain. The prerogative of the royal mercy was often extended to those sentenced to hang, especially if their crimes were political. However, once the machinery of transportation had begun to turn, one could not jump free. Yet English life was so enlaced with patronage, with lines of favour and gratitude running throughout the strata of the social pyramid from navvy to duke, that prisoners and their families would seize any chance of mitigation after sentencing. In 1798, a gentleman named Waller writes to his acquaintance in Sydney, the Irish dynast and assistant surgeon for the colony, Darcy Wentworth. He interceded for what he called an unfortunate young man who has been cast for transportation for the trifling sum of £half a crown. His situation, he says, is so much more to be pitied, as he has not only borne a universal good character, but was the whole supporter of a sickly old father and an aged mother, who is now standing weeping before me, and laments the loss of a son. The only favour she begs of you, sir, is that you will be so obliging as to render him any service which is in your power, that his situation may be a little more comfortable. It was by no means unusual for the victim of the crime to petition on the prisoner's behalf once he or she had realised the terrible fate that lay in store for the convict in Australia and his abandoned family in England. Many Englishmen and Englishwomen were disturbed by the disproportion between crime and punishment, and did not want to carry on their consciences the stigma of destroying a whole family over some relatively trivial possession, especially when it had been stolen in time of general need. William Tidman, a farmer at St Albans, had lost some sacks of wheat to an agricultural labourer named Thomas Tate, now lying, he wrote, at Woolwich under sentence of transportation for 7 years. He asked Viscount Sidmouth to remit Tate's sentence on behalf of his wife and 4 small children, as I freely forgive him myself. The hope of remission through influence, then, was a constant theme. So was the terror of losing touch. Men on the edge of transportation, about to slip off the social map into the void of the Antipodes, were apt to construe every postal delay as a sign of rejection, like poor Thomas Holden writing to his mother. Nothing in this life gives me such uneasiness as not hearing from you. I have not received a letter but one, and that was from my wife since I received my trial. Surely you have not forgot me so soon. Let me know if there is any hopes of my time being shortened. I will expect to see you. If not, it will break my heart, that I may take my last farewell of you, as I shall never think of seeing you after I leave. Most transportees were neglected and many brutalised on this stage of their journey. The parliamentarian Henry Bennett, in an indignant booklet addressed to the Home Secretary in 1819, wrote of convicts on the road to the hulks. Among them were several children, all heavily fettered, ragged and sickly. The women, too, were brought up ironed together on the tops of coaches. Hundreds of them went down from London in what he called an open caravan, exposed to the inclemency of the weather, to the gaze of the idle and the taunts and mockeries of the cruel, thus exciting the shame and indignation of all those who feel what punishment ought to be. John Ward, in 1841, went down to the Portsmouth hulks from Northampton jail in a coach, leg shackled to 6 other prisoners, treating them to gin and ale whenever the Black Maria stopped at a coaching inn to change horses, which he thought seemed to shorten the night's fatigue and lessen our uneasiness. But though he was well clothed, his fellow prisoners had, he said, scarcely enough clothing to cover their nakedness, and could only raise 18 pence between them. The site of the hulks at Portsmouth, Deptford or Woolwich was deservedly famous. They lay anchored in files on the grey heaving water, bow to stern, a rookery of sea-isolated crime. As the longboat bearing its prisoners drew near, the bulbous oak walls of these pensioned-off warships rose sheer out of the water, patched and queered with excrescences, deckhouses, platforms and lean-tos, sticking at all angles from the original hull. They had the look of slum tenements, with lines of bedding strung out to air between the stumps of the masts, and the gun ports barred with iron lattices. They wallowed to the slap of the waves, and dark fleeces of weed streamed in the current from the rotting waterlines. Some were French warships captured in battle, but most were obsolete first-raters that had once borne 100 guns for England. Now all that remained of their pride was a battered figurehead and the rusty chains, each link half the size of a man, that held them to their last anchorage. They were like floating Piranesi ruins, cramped and wet inside, dark and vile-smelling. The reception never changed. The new convicts were mustered on the quarter-deck and ordered to give their money to the captain for safekeeping. The old hulk hands would descend on the new like locusts. Mansfield Silverthorpe, an impecunious young actor who, having trod the boards in the 1830s as Iago and the Ghost in Hamlet, stole a trunk from a Scottish officer and was sentenced to transportation, and went in irons down the river to Woolwich on a public steamer, still in his frilly shirt and long tumbling locks. He found that, on the Ganymede hulk, I was soon metamorphosed into a very different-looking animal. My long hair underwent the operation of clipping by the barbarous barber. I was then soaked in a cold bath, and afterwards was arrayed in the uniform of the hulks. When the quartermaster took our clothes from us, I observed that he thrust a knife through each article, and they are then considered to be the property of the Queen. However, when he came to mine, which were of the best quality, he omitted this act, and since my new shirt scraped me very much, I asked him to let me wear the one I had brought down. But he threatened to flog me for what he called my impudence, and told me all my clothes would be burned. Next week, I was not at all surprised to see my own hat and satin scarf adorning his goodly person, and my coat and trousers that of the captain's son, a young man of about my own size. Every kind of graft and corruption flourished in the hulks. George Lee, sentenced to 14 years' transportation for having a forged banknote, wrote in January 1803 from his captivity on a hulk in Langston Harbour to denounce what he called the bad police and the injudicious government so prevalent in places of this kind, making them in reality seminaries, not of penitence and reform, but of every vice which degrades human nature below the ferocious brute. A 14-pound iron was riveted to each felon's right ankle as a practical discouragement to swimmers. Some were more heavily ironed, for no apparent reason. Bennett in 1817 saw a very little boy of 13 years of age miserably creeping about the Hulk Leviathan in double fetters, while adult men wore single ones. Presumably the child had not been able to pay the warder's bribe for easement of irons, and an example was made of him. The food was adequate if one got one's whole ration, but that did not always happen. There were 3 meat days a week on which the convicts were issued what was called an institutional pound, or 14 ounces, of fresh raw meat. But as it passed down the line to the convict, first the steward took his cut, and then the cook, and then the inspectors, and then the boat's crew who rowed the food ashore, and lastly the dock overseer, and at the end the convict was lucky to get 4 ounces clapped on a pound of stuff named bread. Discipline was a foretaste of what the convicts were to expect on the Bay side, as Australia was called. The great emblem of desire and repression in Hulk life, more than sex or food, or in some cases even freedom itself, was tobacco. Possession of tobacco was severely punished, but the nicotine addict would go through any degradation to get it. Silverthorpe noted how this cycle of addiction and flogging broke prisoners down. They grow indifferent, he said. They go from bad to worse until they have shaken off all moral restraint. Each prisoner's life was governed by a maze of rules, interpreted at the whim of the Hulk's quartermaster. Sometimes my iron was too dirty, at other times too bright. At one time my hat was not properly poised on my head, at another my neckerchief was not tied according to the rules of the establishment. These gave endless scope for extracting bribes, large and small, from prisoners or their families. 3 gold sovereigns bought Silverthorpe a transfer from coal heaving to easier labour for 3 months. Even the doctors were on the take. When a Hulk prisoner died, his corpse would sometimes be sold for £5 or £6 to the dissectors' agents who haunted the docks, instead of being buried on the cemetery mudbank in the Portsmouth estuary known as Rat's Castle. And die they did in numbers, because the naval doctors saw no harm in bleeding a sick prisoner a pint too much. Then the coffin would be rowed over to Rat's Castle, where a chaplain intoned his brief exequies over a box full of stones and sand. Thus, few prisoners looked forward to a spell in the hospital hulk. But nearly all of them lived, and for them the day came eventually. Cast for transportation, they filed on board the Bay ship. The popular Australian stereotype of convict identity says that convicts were innocent victims of unjust laws, torn from their families and flung into exile on the world's periphery for offences that would hardly earn a fine today. They poached rabbits, or they stole bread to feed their starving offspring, and they had to because their rulers had so brutally mismanaged England that they could no longer survive as honest yeomen in a collapsing rural economy. Crushed between economic forces they could not understand and laws they had not written, they were the people that Thomas Gray apostrophised in Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, 1750, and Oliver Goldsmith in 1770 in The Deserted Village. The stereotype insists that the human fodder of transportation sprung from the root of British decency, the yeoman in the rural village. From there it was only a step to the full form of the myth, stated more than 60 years ago in the rhetorical question of an Australian historian, Arnold Wood: is it not clearly a fact that the atrocious criminals remained in England while their victims, innocent and manly, founded the Australian democracy? It was no fact, but a stout and consoling fiction. The innocence of convicts as a class, if not their manliness, was first exposed to criticism by the historian Manning Clark in the 1950s and finally demolished with statistical analysis by another historian, L.L. Robson, in 1965. Basing his work on a random sampling of one name in 20 in the Home Office papers in the London Public Record Office, which lists the names, ages, places of trial and crimes of about 150,000 of the transportees, Robson was able to show that, far from being first offenders, 1/2 to 2/3 of the convicts carried previous convictions. 8 in 10 were thieves, and only a minuscule fraction could be classed as political offenders. Most were city dwellers, not villagers or peasants. Nearly all were propertyless labourers rather than smallholders. 3/4 of them were single, and their average age was about 26. The idea of the convict that one might extract from the earliest transportation records, an old woman who stole cheese, a mere child, a harmless wigmaker's apprentice, or a sensitive Scots forger-painter like Thomas Watling, is very far from the whole truth about the majority of convicts who came later. The ferocity and scope of 18th century capital statutes created an extraordinary range of hanging crimes. The erratic mercy of the courts could, and did, transmute such sentences to exile in Australia. And hence, many early convicts, up to the time of the Napoleonic Wars, went on board the Bay ships for small and often ridiculously slight offences. But after 1815, the general tendency, to which of course there were thousands of exceptions, was to reserve transportation for less trivial crimes. By 1818, the first stirrings of post-war legal reform were felt in England. A parliamentary committee urged that some kinds of theft, though by no means all, should be punished by transportation, not death, and that forgery should cease to be a capital offence. Sir Robert Peel's attempts to reform and consolidate the criminal statutes of the 1820s did have a gradual effect on men in the dock, and as the number of hanging crimes shrunk, so the volume of transportable offences grew. There was no third choice, for England had no penitentiary system, could not keep her felons at home, and would not be forced to do so until the Prison Acts of 1835 and 1839. Consequently, each liberalisation of the criminal law helped to increase the flow of convicts to Australia. Only extreme Tories saw the period 1820 to 1840 as a time of reckless liberalisation of the criminal law, but a sense of humanity did creep forward. By 1837, hanging was mainly restricted to cases of murder, while crime after crime, like forgery, cattle theft, housebreaking, was relegated to the less terrible and magical status of a transportable offence. Slowly, the English authorities acknowledged the mistakes and fantasies that had led their predecessors to fetishise the death penalty. But the real rise of transportation began not with the law itself, but with its new enforcers, the peelers, the English police, established by Sir Robert Peel in 1827. A police force meant a huge rise, not in gross crime, but in successful arrests and convictions. Likewise, the abandonment of transportation was not caused by any fall in crime, but by three other factors: the growing moral and political opposition to the system among English reformers in the 1830s, the growth of an alternative English penitentiary system, and the Australians' own opposition to a continuous dumping of fresh criminals on what, after 50 years of settlement, they had come to see as their own soil. A graph of transportation to Australia would run fairly flat, though uphill, from 1788 to 1816, and then climb more steeply, shoot to a peak in the mid-1830s, and then flatten again. After 1850, the English prison and penitentiary system could hold nearly all the criminals that the courts could convict. Transportation to New South Wales finished in 1840, to Van Diemen's Land in 1853, and by 1868, when the last convict ship from England discharged its Irish prisoners on the other side of the continent in Western Australia, transportation was part unpleasant memory and part unhealed wound. By 1868, transportation was all over, except for the social and the psychic results. These were considerable, for a young country does not serve as the pad on which England drew its sketches for the immense gulags of the 20th century without acquiring a few marks and scars. There were no fashions in English crime. Poverty begets theft monotonously, predictably, and year after year the same proportion held. About 4/5 of all transportation was for offences against property. Only a little more than 3% of the male convicts went down for offences against the person, which ranged from assault, rape, kidnapping, and a few statistically negligible sodomy convictions to manslaughter and murder. A meagre 4% were under sentence for offences of a public nature, which embraced an assortment of acts thought to undermine the rights or prestige of the realm. Men outnumbered women 6-1. Over the whole transportation period, only 24,960 women were sent out, half to New South Wales and half to Van Diemen's Land. Probably 60% of the male English convicts had previous convictions, and 35% are known to have been charged with as many as 4 early offences. With women it was the same. A little more than 2 in 10 had certainly never been convicted before, but the probable ratio of second offenders, or worse, was about 60%. The system swelled in the 1830s because its administrative machinery had improved, that is, more criminals were caught and processed. This did not imply a catastrophic increase in crime, even though there was no end of talk about crime waves. Rather, because it was working so much better, it was able to gratify the social desires of respectable Britons much more readily. It answered a deep desire for sublimation and generalisation. Few people want to take direct responsibility for hanging. Understandably, they prefer abstractions, the course of justice, debt to society, exemplary punishment, and prefer these to the concrete fact of a terrified stranger choking and pissing at the end of a rope. Likewise, the idea that flogging reforms the criminal was an abstraction. The realities of the lash were only apparent where the cat of nine tails met the skin. Neither the man inside the skin nor the other wielding the cat was apt to think that an act of reformation was taking place. What happened was crude ritual, a magical act, akin to the scouring out of devils. All punishment seeks to reduce its objects to abstractions so that they can be filled with a new content invested with the values of good social conduct. But the main use of prison, from the viewpoint of the respectable, is simply to isolate and neutralise the criminal. Australia met this requirement perfectly. Since it was not a building but a continent, it could receive a whole class with room to spare. And it was a class, not just an aggregation of individual criminals that the English authorities thought they saw. We are used to thinking of the language of class as the language of the working class, perhaps because, as Gertrude Himmelfarb suggested, social history has generally been written by labour historians and socialists. But the language of class in the 1830s was mostly invented and used by a middle class trying to describe the social complications that surrounded it, and it did not resemble the scheme of a two-class society, proletariat versus bourgeoisie, that Engels would later invent. Instead of a working class, they spoke of working classes, an idea that reeks of false consciousness in Marxist nostrils, but which in the 1830s seemed to recognise the variety of interests among working people. Even Chartists and other radicals usually spoke of a singular middle class and plural working classes or working people. The idea of a criminal class, as understood by the English in the 1830s, meant that a distinct social group produced crime, as hatters produce hats or miners coal. It was part mob, part tribe, and part guild, and it led a subterranean existence below and between the lower social structures of England. The criminal class has its own argot, its hierarchies, its accumulated technical wisdom. It preserved and amplified the craft of crime, passing it on from master to apprentice. This idea emerged from the late 18th century perception that crime in England had risen so fast that authority must deal with an orchestration and not just an accumulation of criminal acts. Around 1800, the mob was seen with every reason as dangerous. It was fuel for the same revolutionary fire that had destroyed the monarchy on the other side of the Channel. Englishmen of property were obsessed with Jacobinism. In their eyes, it justified every resurgence of repression, inhibited every effort at reform, and deeply unsettled the poise with which they had hitherto contemplated the lower classes. It also lent a pervasive, if unconscious, tinge to all guesses about the nature and composition of the mob. Their fear of the political threat translated itself into repeated exaggerations of criminal nature. Thus it was all too easy to assign criminal propensities to the marginal, the outcast, the rag and boner, in short, to those who might be seen as English sans-culottes. For that large tract where the unpropertied survived, where tricks of subsistence had to be invented from day to day, where the cunning, the illicit and the illegal blended into one another without fine distinction, they had only one name: the criminal class. Belief in a criminal class was self-fulfilling, mainly because it made rehabilitation so difficult. Once off the edge, it was not easy to find another respectable job. Records were better in 1830 than in 1770, and they could be checked by any prospective employer. The official inquiries into crime, drunkenness, prisons and transportation that were held between 1815 and 1840 tended to confirm the same view of crime, that its class nature mattered more than its causes. The criminal class, in the view of one writer in 1854, constitutes a new estate in utter estrangement from all the rest. But how threatening was it? The difference between the criminal classes of London and the classe dangereuse of Paris was that the English were in fact not as dangerous. If English crime, unlike French, seemed to present no political threat to the state as such, it certainly menaced its citizens, chiefly the labouring poor. The criminal class threatened middle-class property, but what most worried the authorities was the moral contagion it offered to workers and their impressionable children. They had tried to remove the bad apples from the lower classes before they could contaminate the good. The new poor laws had tried to separate the independent labouring poor from the paupers. The ragged schools tried to keep the offspring of the lowest and the most depraved paupers apart from the respectable ones. Transportation sought to remove once and for all the source of contamination from the otherwise decent bosom of the lower classes and to ship it beyond the seas to a place from which it could not easily return. There it would stay, providing a kind of slave labour for colonial development and undergoing such mutations towards respectability as whips and chains might induce. The main point was not what happened to it there, but that it would no longer be here. The final aim of the transportation system, then, was less to punish individual crimes than to uproot an enemy class from the British social fabric. Here lay its peculiar modernity, its prediction of the vaster, more efficient techniques of class destruction that would be perfected a century later in Russia. However, it failed. Transportation did not stop crime in England, or even slow it down. The criminal class was not eliminated by transportation, and could not be because transportation did not deal with the causes of crime. Consider a voice from this class, written by the wife of a thief bound early for the fatal shore, which recounts in bare language the descent into a crime of desperation that must have been traced by thousands of convicts in an England without pity for what it called the undeserving poor. Isaac Nelson, clerk, has been sentenced to 7 years' transportation. His crime was stealing a quantity of plated goods from a former employer in Birmingham, Matthew Bolton, whom he had served with what his wife called the uttermost fidelity for 3 years. After quitting Bolton's service, he had come to London and worked for several employers, all of whom signed the letter as character witnesses. Nelson's wife begs to assure the authorities that she is petitioning that her husband, after losing his last job with a Piccadilly optician, from that time was so unfortunate as to be destitute of all kind of employment for upwards of 12 months, in which time we were reduced to the uttermost distress imaginable. Myself afflicted with illness the whole time, and in want for the common necessities of life through a long and severe winter, and my husband, the only one I had to look up to get support, deprived of the means to gain subsistence, and in the deplorable situation to heap up the measure of our misfortunes, I was delivered of a male infant who died in a few days from want of proper nourishment, myself being in so weak a condition as not to be able to afford it any assistance. Think, most gracious sir, the feelings of a husband who tenderly loved a wife, and had always been used to afford a comfortable subsistence for her, to see her in such a situation without the possibility of relieving her wants, and I may humbly hope that the gates of mercy will not be shut against him. Isaac Nelson had gone back to Birmingham and got a job at Bolton's for 6 weeks at 10 shillings and sixpence a week, which was garnished to repay his coach fare and an employer's advance. His wife in London was still destitute and frantic, and so, in a fit of distraction, he stole the silverware, which was recovered later. Mrs. Nelson goes on to tell the Home Secretary that, you will in humanity to a poor unfortunate man be pleased to interview with his Majesty to grant him his most gracious pardon, or that he will mitigate his sentence by allowing him to stay the time of his sentence in England, or allow your petitioner the favour to accompany her husband in his exile, that she may be able to afford him some consolation amidst his afflictions, as his long confinement joined to his other troubles, being of a weak constitution, has brought him into a deep consumption that has nearly reduced him to the grave. The mercy and goodness of George III did not extend so far, and Isaac Nelson sailed for Australia. Such lives confirm the truth of Edward Thompson's bitter remark that the worst offence against property was to have none. We do not know, and never will, how many Isaac Nelsons figured in the criminal classes. At the same time, rising somewhat on the scale of culpability, people were transported for offences that the law condemned, but that their communities tended to condone. Some popular codes stood at a sharp angle to the law. Thus youths made heroes of highwaymen, and whole communities in Cornwall and Devonshire not only engaged in wrecking, but claimed a traditional right to plunder ships. In smuggling communities along the Sussex coast, men used every shift to avoid the excise on rum and tea, despite the threat of transportation and the gallows. Poaching was another offence that few countrymen, if any, thought was wrong, for the poaching laws were among the most corrupt of all English statutes. In some, they forbade a man to kill a wild animal, even on his own land, unless he could show an income of £100 a year from a freehold estate. Since a labourer in 1830 might expect to make between £10 and £20 a year, the poaching laws were a constant theatre of class conflict. The popular legend of transportation in Australia still insists that there were many convict poachers, but there were not. The number of men transported for poaching was infinitesimal, about the same as those sent out for buggering sheep or boys. Those poachers who did get sent to Australia were usually convicted for resisting arrest or assaulting a gamekeeper, not just for the pheasant in the pocket. It was very hard to find witnesses in village communities. Nevertheless, the fact that the authorities pursued country people for such morally insignificant crimes and were quick to identify them with the dissolute and idle rather than the working peasantry shows that there was as wide and ill-recognised a grey area between harmless offence and real crime like sheep or cattle stealing, which were acts condemned by all villagers, in the country as in the town. Illustrators depicted the criminal type as a mask of low cunning, stunted but alert. In fact, there was no difference between the look of English criminals and that of the working class from which they came. Against the jargon of criminal types and the pseudo-scientific babble of the phrenologists, one must balance the description of cotton mill workers offered by Peter Gaskell in 1833. An uglier set of men and women it would be impossible to congregate in a small compass. Their complexion is sallow and pallid, with a peculiar flatness of feature caused by the want of a proper quantity of fat to cushion out their cheeks. Their stature low, the average height being 5 feet 6 inches, their limbs slender and playing badly and ungracefully with a very general bowing of the legs. The convict's height was not always recorded, but they tended to be short. They shared other traits with lumpen workers, chiefly a loathing of authority. The criminal classes of England were apolitical. On that, all observers agreed. They played no role whatsoever in the radical disturbances of the day. Tribal loyalties could be fanatically strong among them. This contemptuous resistance to everyone and everything outside one's small group was one of the roots of Australian mateship. But no convict ever felt that all convicts were his brothers. They would often trample and oppress one another, behaving with the utmost cynicism and cruelty towards weaker prisoners. And often they would not. There was no hard and fast rule of convict solidarity. From authorities' point of view, the London sneaksman had something in common with the Northumbrian cattle rustler. Both had broken the law. But the two men who knew nothing of one another's background and barely had a language in common would feel no bond at all. Most were irreligious too, except obviously the Irish, since the reformed man or woman devoted to Methodist enthusiasm and the evangelical meeting was the last person apt to be transported. Chaplains on convict vessels and Tractarians visiting the hulks felt like missionaries among hostile white heathens. They respected neither God nor man, but truckled shamelessly to both when expediency whispered. Mateship, fatalism, contempt for do-gooders and God-botherers, harsh humour, opportunism, survivors' disdain for introspection, and an attitude to authority in which private resentment mingled with ostensible resignation. Such was the meagre baggage of values that the convicts brought with them to Australia. They also brought, if men, the phallocracy of the tavern, and if women, a kind of tough passivity, a way of seeing life without expectations. What they bequeathed to their native-born Australian offspring, the currency of the colony, as distinct from the sterling or the English-born free settlers, was summed up by the Australian poet James Macaulay in the 1950s as a futile heart within a fair periphery. The women are hard-eyed, kindly, with nothing inside them. The men are independent, but you could not call them free. Only a few convicts were sent out for political offences, yet transportation was an important part of the machinery of English state repression. The right to send political offenders to Botany Bay was jealously wielded by the British government. English interests did not want to make martyrs of radicals, and there were obvious constitutional problems attached to hanging a dissenting clergyman for owning a copy of Tom Paine. But transportation got rid of the dissenter without making a hero of him on the scaffold. He slipped off the map into a distant limbo where his voice fell dead at his feet. There was nothing for his ideas to engage, if he was an intellectual, no machines to break or ricks to burn, if a labourer. He could preach sedition to the thieves and the cockatoos, or to the wind. Nobody would care. Transportation would deal effectively with representatives of nearly every English protest movement, industrial upheaval and agrarian revolt for the next half-century. But first, it would deal with the Irish. Australia was the official Siberia for Irish dissidents at the turn of the century. Their presence there caused the system acute strain and insecurity. Rebellious Irishmen, known as United Irish and Defenders, had been sent out in dribs and drabs during the 1790s, but between 1800 and 1805 their influx began in earnest, swollen by political exiles transported for their role in the rebellion of 1798, when Ireland tried unsuccessfully to ally with France in revolt against England. The Irish, on arriving in Australia, were treated as a special class. As bearers of Jacobin contagion, as ideologically and physically dangerous traitors, they were oppressed with special vigilance and unusually hard punishments. They formed Australia's first white minority. From the outset, the Irish in Australia saw themselves as a doubly colonised people.
In 1804, the Irish launched a futile rebellion, the only concerted uprising ever to take place on the Australian mainland. The Irish remained a clannish minority, keeping the memory of the convict stain alive long after the system of transportation ended. The sense of a community divided between English Protestant haves and Irish Catholic have-nots influenced patterns of power in Australian life for another 150 years. English political dissidents, on the other hand, often shed their radical attributes. Having protested against dismal economic conditions at home, they stayed on as emancipists once they served their sentences. In Australia, they enjoyed the high wages skilled labor could command in the pioneering settlement.
Most prisoners of the system acquiesced in their fate. They waited out their time, knowing that longer and worse constraint, the Triangle, the Iron Gang, or Norfolk Island, would be the price of rebellion. But in any carceral society, there is always a spark of genius for escape. The worse the odds, the more hope escape gives others. In Australia, it was easy to escape. The hard thing was to survive. The odds against survival were high, but hundreds of convicts made their bets. Some confronted Australia's external wall, the sea. They stowed away, or hijacked ships, or built their own rafts, or stole a longboat. Others took to the land, even less charted than the sea. At first these runaways were called banditti, evoking ragged romantic figures among dark caverns. More colloquially, they were known as bolters. In time, the skulking escapee became that primal figure of popular Australian culture, the bushranger, enemy of flogger, cop and magistrate, the poor man's violent friend, the emblem of freedom in a chained society. At first, from the 1790s to the early 1800s, most of the runaways went inland. After a brief exhilaration, they either died or wandered broken back to the settlement, so squalid and lean, one colonial observer remarked, that the very crows would have declined their carcasses. There were reports that 50 skeletons picked white by dingoes and birds could be seen on a day's march from Sydney to Botany Bay. The most persistent absconders were the Irish, who in their ignorance had constructed a paradise myth to alleviate their Antipodean purgatory. They kept sneaking out of the settlement in the belief that, as one of them put it to Watkin Tench, a considerable distance to the northward existed a large river which separated this country from the back part of China, and that when it should be crossed, which was practicable, they would find themselves among a copper-coloured people who would receive and treat them kindly. This fantasy of escape to China was one of the obsessive images of early transportation. As the settlement slowly moved outwards and tracks were made through the raw bush, even the blindest optimist could see that the convict skeletons that kept turning up must mean something. The will to walk to Peking gutted out as it became clear that the logical escape route from this continental prison was not the land, but the sea. The sea route produced one epic escape in the early 1790s, whose notoriety blossomed in London, reached back to Botany Bay, and gave heart to would-be absconders for years to come. It was led by a woman, Mary Bryant, the girl from Botany Bay, as the English press later dubbed her, who, with her 2 small children, her husband William Bryant and 7 other convicts, managed to sail a stolen boat all the way north from Sydney to Timor, a distance of 3,250 miles in just under 10 weeks. No one since James Cook in the Endeavour 21 years before had sailed all the way up the eastern coast of Australia through the treacherous Barrier Reef and lived to tell about it. Mary Bryant, née Broad, was a sailor's daughter from the little port of Foy in Cornwall. She'd been transported for 7 years for stealing a cloak, and she went with the First Fleet on the transport Charlotte. Before the fleet reached Cape Town, Mary Bryant gave birth to a girl and named her Charlotte after the ship. Soon after the fleet reached Port Jackson, Mary Broad married one of the male convicts who fathered her second child, Emmanuel, born in April 1790. He too was Cornish and had come out on Charlotte. He was a 31-year-old fisherman named William Bryant. Like many another Cornishman who kept a boat on that wild and indented coast, Bryant was a smuggler as well as a sailor, and in 1784 he'd been convicted of resisting arrest at the hands of the tax officers. He'd already spent 3 years in the hulks when the First Fleet sailed, and his full 7-year sentence still loomed before him. A fisherman was just what the half-starved colony needed. Governor Phillip put Bryant in charge of the boats that hauled the fishing nets every day in the harbour, but the black market opportunities were too good for a Cornish smuggler to resist. He was caught selling some of his fish on the sly instead of delivering them all to the government store, and for this he got 100 lashes. If he had not set his heart on it before, Bryant was now determined to escape. At worst, he'd rather drown quickly at sea than starve inch by inch on land. He had access to the boats, but no weapons, tools, navigational instruments, charts or food. Then in October 1790, an East Indies trader, the Waxhamhade, lumbered into Port Jackson heavily freighted with stores from Jakarta. Her Dutch captain felt no obligations to the English convict system. He listened to Bryant and was persuaded to part with a compass, a quadrant, muskets, food, and even a chart of the waters between Sydney and Timor. Bryant hid this precious stuff in rolls of bark under the floorboards of his hut and began assembling a crew. He picked his time carefully. In March 1791, The little ship Supply was dispatched to Norfolk Island, and at the end of the month of Axamhyde, having sold the last of her cargo and finished her repairs, also set sail. Now there were no ships left in Port Jackson, nothing that could overtake an escaping boat. On the night of March 28, in the dark of the moon, the Bryants, their 2 children and 7 other convicts, scrambled into the governor's own 6-oar cutter. In nervous silence, holding their breaths every time the oar blades kissed the dark water, they rowed out into the harbour, past the little island of Pinchgut, heading east to the gate of the Pacific. The lookout on South Head did not see the cutter as it crept by in the night below. They turned north towards New Guinea. Their escape caused consternation the next morning. The officers could hardly believe that although most of the men who escaped had connections with female convicts in the settlement, not one woman had breathed a word about the long-laid escape plan. At first the going was easy. At their landings they found edible palms whose hearts they chopped out, a vast quantity of fish which was of a great refreshment to us, and natives either friendly or timid. But then the rain poured and the seas rose, and for 5 continuous weeks they were soaked to the skin and rarely able to light a cooking fire. On the long stretch of surf-bound coast between Port Macquarie and Brisbane, they were driven out to sea by an adverse wind, and, making no harbour or creek for near 3 weeks, we were much distressed for water and food. There was a brief respite for them, probably in Moreton Bay. But on leaving that, they were blown out to sea again, helpless before a heavy gale of wind and current, and expecting every moment to go to the bottom. After several days of this ordeal, they were blown ashore, half dead, on one of the desert islands of the Barrier Reef. On its coral they found turtles, one of which furnished a noble meal for us this night. They butchered a dozen and made jerky of their meat, and thus victualled they made the coast again and kept creeping north, stopping for water wherever they could get ashore, and caulking the boat, whose seams were loosened by the incessant pounding of the ocean, with soap and turtle fat, while fighting skirmishes with hostile blacks. Food was short all the way, but they were all still alive when they turned the point of Cape York Peninsula, the northernmost tip of Australia, and found themselves in the Arafura Sea, with a clear run, pursued part of the way by cannibals in mat-sailed canoes, of 500 miles of open water to Arnhem Land, and then another 500 to Timor. They reached Kopang in Timor on June the 5th, and passed themselves off to the local Dutch governor as survivors of a shipwreck on the Australian coast. In new clothes, with full bellies, they settled down to wait for a ship back to England. But after a couple of months, by the account of one of the castaways, William Martin, Bryant, for some unexplained reason, told the truth to the Dutch governor. Perhaps he got drunk. William Bryant, said Martin, had words with his wife and went and informed against himself, wife, children, and all of us, upon which we was immediately taken prisoners and was put in the castle, where we were strictly examined. The governor had put them in detention, and in mid-September some more shipwrecked Englishmen arrived from the sea at Kopang. Captain Edward Edwards, who had been chasing the Bounty mutineers. Edwards took the Bryants and their companions prisoner. They were clapped in irons and shipped to Batavia. In that disease-ridden port, both William Bryant and his little son Emmanuel died of fever just before Christmas 1791. The survivors were shipped back to the Cape and then to London. On May the 5th, Mary Bryant's 3-year-old Charlotte died and was buried at sea. When Mary reached London and was committed to Newgate as an escaped felon, all she could look forward to was another transport ship, more irons, and a second voyage to Botany Bay. But Mary Bryant soon acquired friends. Word got out about that indomitable curiosity, the girl from Botany Bay, who had so far overcome the inherent weakness of her sex as to make this epic voyage through cannibals, coral, fever islands, and mountainous seas from the edge of the chart back to England and civilization. Surely a just government could not send this bereaved heroine and her companions back to the thief colony? So thought James Boswell, for one, and this kind-hearted writer pressed Dundas, the Home Secretary, and Evan Nepean, the Under-Secretary of State, with letters urging clemency and pardon for her. In May 1793, Mary Bryant received an unconditional pardon. Boswell then settled an annuity of £10 on her, and back she went to Cornwall.
Whether attempting to escape by land or sea, convicts faced a desperate dilemma. The rigors of the wild killed them, or, on occasion, they killed one another, reduced by starvation to cannibalism. Once apprehended, they faced hanging or merciless flogging, but a handful of escapees avoided death or apprehension.
Hundreds of escaped convicts ended up scattered as beachcombers in remote parts of the Pacific. Strangers in their new societies and scandals to their old, they contributed their own violence and opportunism, incubated and hardened by the system, to the ruin of the island cultures. By 1850, there was no part of the Pacific where the name of Botany Bay did not carry a sour, infected reek, the breath of England gone carious in double exile. In early New South Wales, up to 1825, the escaped convict was a bogey, a nuisance, an embarrassment to the seamless image of authority, but rarely more than that. In Van Diemen's Land, however, he became a social force. The Tasmanian bushrangers began as convict kangaroo hunters who had stayed out in the bush and formed gangs. Until the mid-1820s, the government had little chance of catching them, since it had few soldiers and none of them were skilled bushmen. No squad of stumbling lobsters in their red coats could take these bandits. In the wild, lovely terrain of Van Diemen's Land, riven by gorges and precipices, that was like trying to pluck quicksilver from a carpet with one's fingers. Besides, some settlers had a vested interest in protecting them. As the populace's food supplies grew more secure and its dependence upon kangaroo meat declined, although the need for the skins remained, as these were the main source of leather, the banditti took to sheep stealing. They would sell the mutton to free farmers for sugar, flour, tea and gunpowder, and vanish into the wild again. They stole from big farmers and sold to small bent ones, and with this began the Robin Hood reputation, wholly undeserved in 9 cases out of 10, of the Australian bushranger. Sometimes assigned convicts would bring food to bushrangers in hiding, and by 1815 there was an efficient network of bandit spies in Van Diemen's Land. One bushranger boasted from his mountain fastness that he had the Hobart newspapers in his hand within 5 hours after they came off the press. These exasperating alliances were forged from a shared hatred for the system. Convicting the bushrangers was a worse headache than catching them. Sheep stealing was a capital crime. Any convict charged with a second and potentially capital offence had to be tried in Sydney. But without witnesses there could be no case, and Sydney was so far north that the settler would have to abandon his farm for several months to go there at his own expense and testify against a sheep duffer. Few could afford to. These cave-dwelling satyrs of the penal system resist all romanticisation. They had long ratty hair, thick beards, roughly sewn garments, and moccasins made of kangaroo hide, a pistol stuck in a rope belt, a stolen musket, and a polecat's stench. When on raids, they blacked their faces with charcoal. Most of them would kill a man as soon as a kangaroo. The bushranger is the first figure in the low undergrowth of Australian literature to be identified with the bush animals, and the identification of the bushranger with national landscape would persist until the railroads put an end to bushranging itself. By taking to the bush, the convict left England and entered Australia. Popular sentiment would praise him for this transvaluation of the landscape, though at a safe distance, of course, for another 150 years.
The convicts who remained within the settlements served their sentences by performing the back-breaking labor of taming a continent.
Nobody on shore in Sydney was blasé about the arrival of a convict transport. For the people who crammed the bobbing flotilla of rowboats around the ship as she warped in, it meant news from home or even the glimpse of a familiar face, pale from life below the hatches. But for the settlers, it meant a small gush of the most precious commodity in Australia, labour. Every convict faced the same social prospects. He or she served the Crown, or, on the Crown's behalf, some private person, for a given span of years. Then came a pardon or a ticket of leave, either of which permitted him to sell his labour freely and choose his place of work. What this came down to, in the common view of English critics of transportation, most of whom had not been to Australia and had no first-hand knowledge of the convict system, was that the Crown used them as slaves until they were judged fit to become peasants. An equation between convictry and slavery was the invariable trope used to attack the system. Some key figures in the convict administration also used it, such as George Arthur, the Tory Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land from 1824 to 1836, but it was most commonly heard from abolitionists in a lengthy succession that began with Jeremy Bentham and William Wilberforce and continued to William Molesworth and Lord Russell in the late 1830s. It lasted, therefore, for 50 years and remained, at least as a figure of speech, largely unquestioned in English liberal circles. But was it correct? Were convicts in fact slaves? And could the matter of their rights, or their lack of rights, be brought under the great moral umbrella of the English abolitionist movement, which had at such vast cost and effort extirpated black slavery from the British Empire, and by the 1830s was busy trying to suppress the tenacious institution of slavery among the Africans and Arabs themselves? English liberal reformers were sure it could. Today, one is less sure. In theory, the social contract of slavery is simple, rigid, one-sided. It is pure power in action. The master owns the slave. He owns his work, his time, his person. Slaves are bought and sold. They are property. Their rights begin and end with their status as chattels. The slave does not have the right to negotiate, to set the tempo or length of his work, to organise collectively, or to protest. Incentives are unknown in the theoretical world of slavery, though not, as the experience of slave societies always shows, in its real world. Slavery is permanent. It perpetuates itself from generation to generation. Slave parents beget slave children. When slaves are freed, it is an indulgence or a revolution. Not one of these conditions applied to the convicts that Britain exiled to Australia. Each served a fixed term of punishment and then became free. None was a chattel, the property of a master. All of them, within limits, had the right to sell some portion of their labour on the free market. Harsh and rigorous as their social world often was, it was enlaced by concepts of right and law, and not of simple ownership. They could appear as witnesses in court. They could bring suits in civil law and write petitions to the governor, which were given full and usually prompt consideration. Their masters did not have the right to flog them. Such punishments could only be inflicted by the sentence of a magistrate, or in later years by two magistrates. A convict could bring a master to court for ill treatment. Often, when they had served their terms, convicts were given land, and they were assigned other convicts to work it. Their children were born free. They could not vote, but neither could anyone else in New South Wales until after 1840. If this was slavery, as its critics insisted, it was not of a kind recognisable in Barbados or Atlanta, let alone in ancient Athens or Rome or Luxor. It had its own name. It was called the assignment system. Most convicts were assigned, or lent out as labourers by the government, to private settlers. A few, perhaps 1 in 10, were kept by the government to labour on public works, digging ditches and tunnels, building jails, courthouses, stores and breakwaters, and making roads through the bush. Thus the government man, a favourite euphemism in a country where the word convict was rarely used, could serve the Crown directly and pay back his debt to English society. Government labour was thought the worst punishment, but assignment was the staff of colonial life for the first 50 years of European settlement. It shaped the colony, it moulded its social institutions, and it was one, if not quite the main reason, why emigrants went there at all. Penal Australia was too distant, weird and tainted to attract many free immigrants from the working class. However, its government hoped to bring in opulent settlers, men of capital, who would spend it in the colony with offers of free land and free labour. In its unexplored vastness, the colony was glutted with land, and the government gave it away. Prime grazing country less than 100 miles from Sydney could still be had for 2 shillings an acre in the 1830s. Because it was far scarcer, skilled free labour was much more valuable than land. It could name its own price. When the green and hopeful colonist brought his free servant to Australia with him, the servant often deserted. Cheap land and free grants meant that anyone with hard hands and a strong back could become his own boss. They also meant that the only stable source of labour, whatever its defects, came from the assignment system, and thus assignment was as important to colonial Australia as black slavery was to the antebellum South, and both had practical disadvantages in common. Black slave labour was rarely as efficient as the paid work of the free. Its unproductiveness was rooted in the effect of slavery on men's souls, because bondage forced the Negro to give his labour grudgingly and badly, and his poor work habits retarded the general level of productivity. Most slaves were employed not on huge plantations like Tara, but in groups of 1 to 10 on modest-sized farms. Slavery suits the production line where each worker does a rigidly set task over and over again with no variation. It also suits the rural ancestor of a production line, the giant farm. But on a small farm, the worker must turn his hand to many tasks, and here the drawbacks of slave labour, lack of skills, absence of initiative, bit deep. Slavery is inherently static, and no slave ever came up with a new farm tool or a better way of using an old one. These drawbacks were just what a pioneer society did not need. But because the assignment system was more open and flexible than slavery, because it left some room for the initiative of the individual convict, if not in working for the master, then in working on his own time, it tended to be more innovative in its deployment of skills. Only in the outer penal settlements like Moreton Bay, McQuary Harbor or Norfolk Island were the rigid, punitive inefficiencies of formal prison labour sustained, with men instead of animals dragging carts, and the hoe used instead of the plough. The economy of the mainland was more dynamic and, as the Australian historian John Hurst pointed out, one of the colony's claims to fame ought to be that it was a forced labour economy which developed a staple industry, wool, in which the forced labourers, the convict shepherds, worked on their own. Still, the convicts had an irreducible unit of labour. They called it the government stroke. Doing it kept you out of the hands of the flogger. You were seen to be working, but that was all. Colonial Australia progressed slowly because of its shortages of capital, its solitudes and distances, its small population, and because jails are inherently conservative. But its worst problem was a labour force with so few incentives to work. The mediocrity of convict labour drove free workers' wages up. Not the slightest dependence can be placed upon convict labour as a permanent source of wealth, said one colonist. But this was not true. What was true was that being the master of assigned convicts did not give anyone the seigneurial confidence of the slave owner, because the government could always take them back. No farmer had a property in his convict servants. They were not part of his capital. Nor would any master see them as morally neutral beings like black slaves. Convicts, by definition, were criminals. They had to be watched closely and kept in rigorous submission. The further away from the city the master was, the harsher his vigilance tended to become, unless he was an ex-convict himself and treated his assigned man softly, an indulgence that colonial conservatives believed only led to disorder. Yet the fact that convict labour produced less than the work of free men did not mean it was unproductive. In fact, fortunes were raised on it. Convicts might not represent capital like slaves, but their work produced the same effect as the expenditure of capital. The operation of the penal system, remarked the author of an emigrant's handbook published in 1851, has altered the face of the country wherever it has been set down, just as manure may be said to have altered the character of a field. It could not produce extravagant surpluses, but it could and did offer the well-organised settler a solid prosperity. Because it favoured standardised work, and because men of influence could get the skilled servants, leaving the lumpen for the lumpen, Assignment worked better for the large farmer than for the dirt-farming dungaree settler. But in either case it had several compelling merits from the viewpoint of the government. First, it was cheap. It got convicts off the stores, and by shifting the cost of their food and keep to private citizens, it saved the British government thousands of pounds a year. Second, it induced well-to-do free settlers to think of emigrating to Australia. Where else in the world could men of responsibility and capital assure themselves a free supply of labour? The authorities in New South Wales and their friends in England were apt to emphasise that advantage. And the assignment system had a third merit: social control. It dispersed convicts all over New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land instead of concentrating them in potentially rebellious groups and gangs. It could also control settlers through patronage. The government could punish a settler by denying him convicts, or reward another by assigning them to him. This damped the political dissensions of free settlers, just as the convicts could be kept in line with the threat of the lash and the promise of eventual freedom. This was a power wielded with special vigour in Van Diemen's Land between 1824 and 1836 under Lieutenant Governor George Arthur, where, according to a wealthy settler, George Meredith, a potential master's access to convict labour depended not on his wants, but on the construction the governor may be pleased to put upon the political sentiments and conduct of the applicant. Arthur's favouritism was such that in 1832 half the skilled artisan convicts in Van Diemen's Land were assigned to 1/10 of the settlers, mostly his own clique of officials. The price of irking the governor might be to lose one's servants a week later, for what the settler is now allowed by the laws to enjoy is a mere indulgence, said Arthur, a temporary, irrevocable loan of services. In the first years of the colony, convicts worked only for the government, which also had a monopoly on all the crops grown. These went into a communal store and were rationed out to the colonists. The first stage of the assignment system, which lasted until 1800, was a refinement of this. The government gave convict labour, clothed and victualled at government expense, to free settlers, but the crops they raised could only be bought by the government at fixed prices. Thus the government store became the sole market. In 1790 there were 38 such assigned convicts in New South Wales working on private farms. By 1800 there were 356, and by December 1825 there were 10,800. As the colony grew and diversified, the government store gave up trying to hold its monopoly on farm produce. As it no longer controlled the market, it didn't want to pay for the upkeep of assigned convicts either. Hence, by a general order issued in October 1800, Governor King changed the system. In this second stage of assignment, the masters had to feed, clothe and shelter their servants, and the government would advance them food and clothing out of its own stores to be repaid at the year's end. A full year's rations for one convict cost about 13 guineas. This not only stimulated farming, it got convicts off the stores so that they cost the government nothing. The master was required to maintain his man on exactly the same terms of work, food and clothing as the felons in government employ. If a settler couldn't support the convict and had to discharge him, he was required to pay the government a shilling for every day of the expired year, a fine that few smallholders could afford. In return, the convict worked the same hours as the government exacted, 10 hours Monday to Friday and 6 on Saturday, giving a 56-hour week. Not a brutal schedule by any means. But every prisoner, whether he worked for the government or a settler, had to do his task of work. Labour by task rather than time followed the logic of having an unwilling convict workforce. It had been excessively difficult to keep the hands at work all day, and the early settlement had no full-time guards except the military, who resented being used as jail overseers. Hence, very early, Governor Phillip adopted the system of fixing an amount of product rather than a span of time as the daily norm, and convicts would work at their own rates. Task work had an association with skilled labour in England. It suggested a higher status than mere toil. In this way, labour negotiations were installed in the fledgling penal colony almost from its birth, not what one would expect in a jail, still less in a slave society. In the early famine years, convicts had been let off work at 3 in the afternoon so that they could raise their own produce. And this dispensation became the custom, and it survived for both private and government workers long after the shortages had passed. Convicts soon came to be paid wages for out-of-hours labour. They could sell this overtime anywhere if the master didn't want to pay for it. How well did the convict's right to earn overtime, which was part of the essence of the assignment system for some 20 years after 1804, translate into spending power? Certainly worse than you would suppose. Successive governors fixed the price of overtime convict labour, but the colony had no money supply. England hadn't sent any money there because one didn't need cash circulating in a jail. Not until 1812 would the Crown dispatch a supply of silver coin to Australia, £10,000, which, as the Select Committee on Transportation had gloomily predicted, was at once sucked out of the colony by its unfavourable balance of trade. As a result, the first 25 years of economic life were a crazy quilt of barter, IOUs and sliding coinage, guineas, johannas, guilders, mohors, rupees, Spanish dollars and ducats, left in the colony by visiting ships. The convicts' paid labour was mercilessly exploited by the means of payment, which was mainly in kind, at the prices of goods fixed by the free settlers. Sometimes the prisoners would be forced to take imported goods they didn't need at all. White cotton dress stockings, for instance, or sheep's rumps, alias lambskins, imported from Cape Town. But the most sought-after commodity of all was rum, a word which stood for spirits of all kinds, arrack, aguardiente, potín, moonshine, but which meant, especially, imported liquor from Bengal. In this little community, less than 5,000 people in 1799, about 7,000 by 1805, and just over 20,000 by 1817, nearly all the men and most of the women were addicted to alcohol. In Australia, especially between 1790 and 1820, rum became an overriding social obsession. Families were wrecked by it, ambitions destroyed, an iron chain of dependency forged. Many colonists drank with an oblivion-haunted thirst, determined to blot out the harsh tenor of their lives, and because most convicts would rather be paid in rum than anything else, it gave great leverage to the wealthy landowner who could secure any amount of overtime labour with a broached barrel. Some authorities thought that the only solution was prohibition, which Governor Thomas Brisbane tried to enforce on Newcastle and the Hunter River Valley settlers in 1824. Ships entering Newcastle Harbour, north of Sydney, had to be placed under bond whether they carried liquor or not, because the mere sight of a possibly rum-laden boat caused confusion and wild uproar. The harsh conditions of colonial life made for heavy drinking. Yet the relationship between drink, wages and work had long been ingrained in England. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, had been astonished to see that his fellow printers in London drank 3/4 of a gallon of strong ale every day at work, supplied against their wages, while the habit of paying workers and craftsmen on Saturday nights from a table in a public house, thus assuring that all but the teetotaler would drink a hole in his salary before he got home, did not die out in London until the 1820s. Certainly few convicts were likely to feel that their rights were under attack if their masters part paid them in rum, and none complained about it. The man who cleaned up this system was Lachlan McQuary, the last British proconsul sent to run New South Wales as a military autocracy. In guts, moral vigour and paternal even-handedness, as well as in his bouts of self-righteousness and bull-headed vanity, McQuary was a fine early example of that breed of Scottish administrators who kept the engine room of empire working throughout the 19th century. The son of a Hebridean tenant farmer, he was to become the Laird of New South Wales, ruling his strange fief from January 1810 to December 1821, the longest tenure of any Australian governor. McQuary had risen through the British Army as a career officer, serving with increasing distinction for nearly 20 years in India and the Middle East. By his 40th year he was a thoroughly seasoned empire hand, a good organiser, resentful of critics, used to prompt obedience, socially rather creaky, but shrewd about the needs of those who fell under his power, an awkward, rusticated jungle-waller, in his own words, ramrod-like in port and bearing, with a bony jaw and eyes as hard as cairngorms.
McQuary believed that convicts should be rehabilitated through work. He advocated convicts' rights on the reasonable premise that after they served their sentences, they would stay on as emancipists, citizens of the colony. McQuary also introduced city planning and oversaw the erection of the first Georgian buildings. His administration was brought down by his perceived leniency toward convicts. England wanted one thing above all else from her colony beyond the seas, that Australia continued to be viewed as an object of real terror. Penal reform, city planning, and even-handed administration of justice did not support this vision. Nonetheless, the question of rights under the assignment system was, in fact, more delicate than it looked.
The most vivid disagreements over the matter of rights were caused by the ticket of leave system. There were only 3 ways in which the law could release a man from bondage. The first, though the rarest, was an absolute pardon from the governor, which restored him to all rights, including that of returning to England. The second was a conditional pardon, which gave the transported person citizenship within the colony, but no right of return to England. And the third was the ticket of leave. The convict who had been given a ticket of leave no longer had to work as an assigned man for a master. He was also free from the claims of forced government labour. He could spend the rest of his sentence working for himself wherever he wanted, as long as he stayed within the colony. He was, as the phrase went, on his own hands, in contrast to the assigned man who was merely said to be off the store. The ticket lasted only a year, and it had to be renewed, and it could be revoked at any time. It was an effective way of fostering conformity and self-help while keeping the convict on a leash. Ticket of leave men could be denounced by anyone, and thus they lived in some uncertainty. As an editorial in the Sydney Gazette put it, a ticket of leave is the most tender kind of liberty that can be imagined. It is liberty in one sense and non-liberty in another. Under the present system, a ticket of leave exempts a man from the service of one master, while upon the other hand he becomes the slave of hundreds of others. From the magistrate down to the meanest constable in the district, a ticket of leave holder is continuously kept the subject of apprehension. One lost one's ticket, Governor King proclaimed in 1804, by being idle, or being insolent to any officer, soldier or constable, or by charging too much for out-of-hours work. But fragile as it was, the ticket of leave was craved by every convict in the colony and regarded by most of them as a natural right, a goal that one struggled towards and was entitled to. It played an immense role in the moral economy of colonial life. The worst thing a master could do to a convict servant was keep him from getting his ticket of leave. The less scrupulous settlers sometimes tried to do that. More convicts were always coming in one end of the system from the transports than were going out the other as ticket of leavers or emancipists. Thus, from January 1826 to December 1828, 6,032 male convicts arrived in Australia, while 4,140 men were added to the free population by the expiry of sentence or the granting of tickets of leave. But this did not reduce the demand for assigned labour, because so many of the newly freed men became farmers themselves and needed working hands. Since convict labour has become so exceedingly valuable as it now is, Governor Gipps reported to the Secretary for War on the Colonies in 1838, it is a matter of very frequent complaint that masters prevent their servants from getting tickets of leave from an unwillingness to lose their labour, and that they even cause, in some cases, their men to be punished for the sake of retaining their services. Each punishment which an assigned man receives puts him back a year in getting his ticket. I am willing to hope that such cases are but few. They were probably more common than Gipps was willing to hope, and they had been going on for nearly 40 years before the government cast an official eye on them. We cannot know how many assigned men were unjustly denied their tickets of leave. Presumably the settlers minimised the number and the convicts exaggerated it. What is not in doubt is the gulf that separated the settlers from the convicts' view of the ticket of leave, one calling it, as the government declared it to be, an indulgence, and the other always claiming it as a right. Their belief in a right to a ticket did not mean that the prisoners were deluded. Rights emerge by bargaining between the powerful and the relatively powerless. They are not simply granted, for if they were, there would be none. Rights are solidified claims, sanctioned by usage and expectation. When the convicts spoke of wider rights than their simple mechanical entitlement to food and shelter, they were speaking from their inherited expectations as labourers, that masters should behave with fairness and that the law should offer them some formal protection to their own interests. In short, they expected the moral and legal economy of the traditional English labour market to apply in the continental prison that was Australia. And that economy did not exclude the common English practice by which free workers, adults as well as apprentices, were bonded to their masters and suffered severe penalties, ranging from fines to ostracism, if they broke away. In this respect, at least, assignment was not as totally foreign to English labour relations as one might assume. But some were cruelly disappointed. The extent to which tyranny was formally carried on with regard to assigned servants throughout the colony, wrote one ex-convict, Charles Cousins, is almost incredible. But a contented convict plainly worked better than a hungry, rebellious one. To that end, as John MacArthur's son James sensibly told the Select Committee on Transportation in 1837, it was best, where a man behaves well, to make him forget, if possible, that he is a convict. And one of the first treatises on Australian farming, written in 1826, advised settlers that the belly is far more vulnerable than the back. The colonist was advised to set up wages and a scale of rewards which will seem a very great boon, and whose withdrawal will be much more effectual than the lash of the flogger. On one hand, don't get familiar with the convicts or give them the idea that their work is indispensable. On the other hand, a master must never forget, as the writer put it, that they are men who, however degraded, still have the same feelings and passions as himself. The right stance was balanced paternalism, the instinctive attitude of the English squire while dealing with his labourers. For that was how the English working man expected his employer to behave. The code of the country gentleman underwrote the modest customary rights of his workers. Most government men in bush service were, if not content with their fate, at least realistic about it. They knew that rebelliousness, insolence, or conspicuous foot-dragging would probably extend their sentences and delay their tickets of leave for years, and they knew as well from experience how pervasive and efficient the pass system was in preventing long escapes. Every convict, when off his master's property for any time or for any reason, had to carry and show on demand a written pass that stated his name, where he had started from, where he was going, and the precise number of days or even of hours that he was to be on the road. Even the worst convict, though he might rob a passing visitor or a new assigned man, would rarely plunder his own master and could be trusted anywhere. And trust built reform. The posting of sanctioned rural relationships on the far soil of Australia mattered greatly to convicts and always evoked their gratitude. Everything else was strange, the bouncing animals, the upside-down stars, the resentful blacks and the 9 agonising claws of the cat-o'-nine-tails. But this was blessedly familiar. Besides, the man assigned to a decent master in the country districts in the 1830s was, as one observer pointed out, in a far better position than half the honest labourers of England. No wonder then that convicts behaved well, and from being useful members of the community gained both the respect of others and learned to respect themselves. Convicts who found benevolent masters far preferred their assigned life to the miseries they had known in England. When they could write home, they stressed their comforts, they reassured their families and begged them not to fret. The sense of opportunity was a common theme. "Dear brother," wrote the rural protester Peter Withers in 1833, "I think you would make your fortune in about 6 years. I should like to see you and your family come to this country if you could get to come, for it would be well for your children after you're dead, for this is a very plentiful country. Provisions is very cheap and labour is dear. This is the pleasantest country that I ever saw." One must read such praise in context. Withers had been a farm worker who had known the dreadful privations of the agricultural collapse whose nadir came in the 1830s, when England went closer to general agrarian revolt than it had been since the days of Wat Tyler. After such miseries, the cheap food and high wages in Australia must have seemed wonderful. In the words of such convicts, the idea of Australia as the paradise of the working man finds its first voice among workers. Probably about 1/5 of the masters in Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales were genuinely interested in reforming their assigned servants, and 2/5 more encouraged the convicts for their own interests. The latter might treat their assigned servants like farm equipment, but at least they would teach them skills and keep them away from bad company. Out in the bush, there were no booze shops, whores or criminal cabals. There, convicts led what the settler John Eyre called a healthy, useful life of labour, well-clothed and well-fed with the prospect of attaining their freedom. So transportation of convicts to a healthy country and the assignment of them to settlers is the true means of reforming the criminals themselves, he concluded. Masters and government authorities generally believed that it was far harder for an assigned convict to go straight in a butcher's shop or wearing servant's livery in Sydney. The city was the condenser of vice. In the bush, there were more routines and less company, and the master's life shared more of the hardships of the servants than in town. In Sydney or Hobart, the master's need to demarcate his life from the felons led to exaggerated rituals of class superiority which promoted the feeling that convicts could not be reformed at all. The issue of class loomed large in penal Australia, a society traversed by confusingly rapid movements of individual status, where tides of men and women were constantly flowing from servitude into citizenhood and responsibility, from bitter poverty to newfound wealth. By the 1830s, Australia was as class-obsessed a society as any in the world. In penal Australia, the question of class was all-pervasive and pathological. Distance had made it so. Tiny as it was, the colony was gnawed by isolation and boredom, plagued by foolish vendettas and extreme class consciousness. Class barriers were translated into personal affronts at the blink of an eye. The atmosphere of New South Wales at the end of the transportation period was summed up in 1839 by someone writing under the pseudonym of a settler, with piercing insight in the Sydney Morning Herald. Quote, "People come here to better their condition, many with limited means, their tempers a little soured with privations and disappointed expectations, for all expect too much. Cut off from the ties of kindred, old friendships and endearing associations, all struggling in the road of advancement, and no one who reflects will be surprised that they jostle one another. Every man does not know his own position so well as at home." One speaks of colonial gentry as though they were gentlemen in early Australia, but they were not. Frontiers have a way of killing, maiming or simply dismissing gentlemen. In any case, most folk with settled estates have no reason to go to a raw new country. They can invest in it later without needing to break their bodies on it now. To succeed on the frontier, a man needed the kind of violent, grabbing drive that only failure or mediocrity in his previous life could fuel. The male society of early New South Wales could therefore be roughly sorted into three kinds of people. There were opportunists struggling to be gentlemen. There were convicts and outcasts waiting to be opportunists. And there were the failures who would never become anything. Social life thus displayed a crude, insecure face which the cosmetic application of airs and graces could not altogether hide. The mixture of ambition and social pretension wearied many a visitor. The relentless deployment of tooth and claw against the tentative mobility of the lower orders would impress Charles Darwin himself with its unpleasant naivety when he arrived in Sydney on the Beagle in 1836. The colonial elite after 1800 had arrived at an idea of gentility that was already becoming, if not obsolete, then certainly old-fashioned in England. It was feudal and rural. It belonged more to the 1720s than the 1820s. It parodied an ideal privilege they had never had and, moreover, was distinguished by its absolute inability to relax. English gentility defined itself in relation to an aristocracy above and a peasantry below, but its vision of the good yeoman did not apply very well in convict Australia, whose peasantry was, by definition, not good. The exclusives had come from nowhere in a generation or two. They were determined to prevent other men, also from nowhere, from getting what they had. Hence their stubborn resistance to the gathering social demands of the emancipists and their Australian-born children. When Governor Lachlan McQuary, who correctly believed that some of the ablest men in the colony were emancipists, invited 4 of them to dinner at Government House in 1810, the exclusives were outraged. When he went further and appointed 2 of these men, the merchant Simeon Lord and the landowner Andrew Thompson, as trustees and commissioners of the new turnpike road that was to be built between Sydney and the Hawkesbury River, the 3rd proposed trustee, the Reverend Samuel Marsden, senior chaplain of the colony and one of its biggest landowners, a merciless Pharisee, was so piqued in his clerical dignity that he refused to serve. This in turn sent the governor into one of his military rages, and the feud between the 2 men poisoned relations between church and state in New South Wales for the rest of Macquarie's term. The exclusives could define their sense of class against the despised emancipists, but they were snobbish as only provincials can be. The tone was faithfully echoed as late as the 1840s by Louisa Ann Meredith, a clergyman's wife who wrote a delectably sharp account of her 5 years in Australia from 1839 to 1844. "The distinctions in society here," she wrote, "remind me of the dockyard people described by Dickens. Thus, government officers don't know merchants, merchants with stores don't know other merchants who keep shops, and the shopkeepers have, I doubt not, a little code of their own, prescribing the proper distances to be observed between drapers and haberdashers, butchers and pastry cooks. This pride of place is so very ridiculous and unbecoming in such a community that, were not its tendency so mischievous, it could only provoke a smile." All colonial standards of rank, etiquette, taste and the interesting were English. Until well into the 1820s, the word Australian was a term of abuse, or at best of condescension. It carried an air of seediness on the rim of the Pacific. The governor was an autocrat presiding over a police state with certain social trimmings. His power was all-encompassing, as befitted the man who ran a continent that was also a jail. All political decisions ran through his hands: who got land, where and how much, who got labour, who was pardoned, freed or sent to a penal station, what religions were celebrated other than the established rites of the Church of England and at what hours, who filled administrative positions, what could be said in the colony's embryonic press, 1,000 matters, loaded or trivial, down to the vexed question of which side of the road the chaotic and ever-increasing traffic of Sydney should move on. Macquarie chose the left, as in Britain. Nowhere in the British Empire did a proconsul have wider social power than in penal Australia. It was in the person of the governor, therefore, that the class divisions of the colony found their basis and their reassurance. If a governor leaned towards populism, showing favour to small farmers or ex-convicts, immense resentments could be released, as they were against Lachlan McQuary. It is not easy to exaggerate the entrenched mentality of the dozen or so clans, starting with the MacArthurs and their allies like Samuel Marsden, who made up the leading free families of Australia. In their desire for signs of status, the colonial Australians developed some unlikely fixations, entirely refuting the idea that remote societies are robustly free of snobbery. Of course, the reverse is true. It's the provinces that fix on style and correctness, since their fate is to reflect distant prototypes. Hence the attention the early Australian gentry paid to form, and their contempt for the pretensions of new emancipist money. Louisa Ann Meredith, the recording angel of the Antipodean drawing room, took one of her finest flights on the subject of risen convicts. "Wealth," she wrote, "all-powerful though it may be, and many of these emancipists are the richest men in the colony, cannot wholly overcome the prejudice against them, although policy in some instances greatly modifies it. Their want of education is an effectual barrier to many, and these so wrap themselves in the love of wealth and the palpable, though misplaced, importance that it gives, that their descendants will probably improve but little upon the parental model. You may often see a man of immense property," she went on, "whose wife and daughters dress in the extreme of fashion and finery, rolling home in his gay carriage from his daily avocations, with face, hands and clothes as dirty and slovenly as any common mechanic. And the son of a similar character has been seen with a dozen costly rings on his coarse fingers, and chains and shirt pins, glistening with gems, buying yet more expensive jewellery and yet without sock or stockings to his feet, the shoes to which his spurs were attached leaving a debatable ground between them and his trousers. Spurs and shoes are, I imagine, a fashion peculiar to this stamp of exquisites, but among them very popular. But how did you distinguish yourself from the spur and shoe men? Much ingenuity was expended on this problem. Beyond drink, social climbing and fornication, the amusements of the upper class of New South Wales were not the same as they are today, and generally not of a distinctly Australian kind. Superior people did not, for instance, swim in the sea or even go to the beach. Sea bathing bore the taint of the imprisoned, because when Sydney convicts washed, they usually had to do it in the salt water. To get a tan for a woman was to plummet from gentility to coarseness. Sunburned skin suggested convict labour and carried overtones of the despicable black savage. Thus, wrote Mrs. Meredith, few ladies venture to risk their complexions to the exposure of an equestrian costume, and accordingly few appear on horseback. The desire not to be like convicts even affected diet. Mrs. Meredith was puzzled by her host's refusal ever to serve fresh fish at luncheon or dinner, despite the superb quality and variety of Sydney seafood. Instead, she was given smoked salmon or dried cod brought from England. This aimed to invert the convict diet. Convicts traditionally ate fresh fish and salted meat, which signified lack of property, for only the landed could enjoy fresh beef or lamb. The ceremonial food of the free must therefore be fresh meat and salt fish. The respectable classes loved horse breeding and horse racing. Australia's equine fixation was fully formed by 1820. They held lavish balls, which some pastoral families would ride 200 miles to attend, for these were the main displays of the colonial marriage market. The dancing was segregated, with emancipists at one end of the room and exclusives at the other, sometimes with different orchestras. Some gentlemen did what English gentry were known to do. They rode to hounds. But there were no foxes in Australia, and so the Cumberland Hunt, as it called itself, donned pink coats amid the old scribbly grey of the bush and went baying, belling and tally-hoing after dingoes. Rarely can Oscar Wilde's definition of hunting as the unspeakable in pursuit of the uneatable have applied so forcibly within the British Empire. The aim was to be as English as possible and to speak of England as home. But the settlers could not follow the changes of English fashion. Their conservatism was underscored by the great Antipodean time lag. Ships would bring out-of-date magazines and newspapers, ancient court news, obsolescent ladies' clothes, and overpriced luxury goods. There was a faded pleasure in gossiping about the Prince of Wales's debts when, for all one knew, they might have been paid before one heard of them, or about the unwonted pregnancy of a country heiress if the baby had presumably already been born. The poverty of conversation could drive an intelligent visitor to despair. Louisa Meredith lamented that none of the colonial elite seemed to have read anything. An apathetic indifference seems the besetting fault, she said, an utter absence of interest or inquiry beyond the merest gossip, the cut of a new sleeve, or the guests at a late party. Do you play? And do you draw? Are invariable inquiries to a new lady arrival. Do you dance is thought superfluous, for everyone dances. But not a question is heard relative to English literature or art, far less a remark on any political event, of however important a nature, not a syllable that betrays thought. And so the image of England slowly dimmed to a nostalgic wraith, a film of imperfect memory. What filled up the horizon, as in small isolated communities it always does, was local news. And the convicts were the necessary low-water mark to which all social heights were compared. The gentry needed them for self-definition, not just for labour. Of course Australia was marked for glory, some wag said, and the saying would be repeated for generations. Its people had been chosen by the finest judges in England. And clearly, one of the things these people did best was breed. A rough census of New South Wales in 1807 showed a total population of 7,563 people. Of these, 1,430 were women, mostly convicts or emancipists, and 1 woman in 3 was married. But the number of children was very high, 807 legitimate, 1,025 not. 1 person in 4 in the colony was a child. More than half the children were illegitimate, and most of them were the offspring of convicts. In 1828, the first official census revealed that there were at last more free people, 20,870, than convicts under sentence, 15,728, in New South Wales. Almost half the free population were ex-convicts who had done their time and received their pardons and stayed. Most of the rest were children born in Australia, whose parents were either ex-convicts or came-free settlers, soldiers, marines, officials large and small, settlers and emigrants of every kind. This first generation of Australians was born free, but it was raised in a police state. The term for these native-born currency lads and currency lasses came from monetary slang. Currency meaning coin or notes that were only good in the colony, makeshift stuff, implying raffishness or worse, unlike the solid virtues of the sterling, the free English emigrants. The currency also called themselves natives, a word not applied to Aborigines, only to locally born whites. From England, the identity of these people looked simple. They were seen in a bald, one-dimensional way as the children of the convicts, heirs of a depraved gene pool from whom little good could be expected. Almost everything that was said about the native born in England, and by English visitors to Australia up to about 1835, tended to assume that they formed a homogeneous group, the children of the convicts. However, the native born did not think of themselves that way, not because they felt up to denying the facts of the colony's birth, but because their society was so much more intricate than England's instrumental view of Australia as a convict dump. In this real society, the children of the free were inextricably mingled in a web of social and economic relations with those of emancipists. The poor were not all convict-born. The rich were not all free. Some children of convicts grew up fighting for crusts, but others had private tutors or went to ladies' schools in Parramatta. Because the native-born were the sons and daughters of all conditions of people, bond and free, they were to be found at every level of colonial Australian society by 1825 and could not be treated as a class on their own. The idea that, in the words of a colonial judge in the 1850s, crime descends as surely as physical properties and individual temperament, this was the very axis of the idea of a criminal class. And it was also, of course, the key reason for all social discrimination by respectable Australians against their others, the emancipists. But it turned out not to be true. Despite all the jeremiads directed against their origins, despite the widespread perception of a permanent groundswell of crime for which they were supposed to be responsible in the colony, the first generations of the native-born turned out to be the most law-abiding, morally conservative people in the place. Among them, the truly durable legacy of the convict system was not criminality, but a revulsion from it, the will to be as decent as possible, to sublimate and wipe out the convict stain, even at the cost, heavily paid for in later education, of historical amnesia. This was to be confirmed by the crime statistics for New South Wales. For instead of growing up depraved, the currency showed the lowest crime rate of any group. Out of 827 men that the Supreme Court Judge W. W. Burton had tried in the years 1833 to 1838, 450 of them, or 54%, were convicts under sentence. 241, or 29%, were emancipists. 50, or 6%, were free emigrants, and only 30, or 4%, were Australian-born. Moreover, none of the currency had committed murder or grand larceny, and the judge had never even heard of one being charged with rape. Of the 30 currency defendants, 13, or nearly half, were up for horse stealing or cattle rustling, which, like poaching in England, ordinary Australians hardly thought were crimes at all. Then how did the cankered stock of English criminality produce such fresh green shoots in Australia? Some observers came up with a theory. It was that the children had a natural aversion to the spectacle of sin. But there is little to support this idea. Australia was a frontier society that rewarded hard work at any level to a degree undreamt of by the English or the Irish poor. The out-of-work blacksmith, reduced to petty theft by a lack of opportunity, could soon become a flourishing tradesman in Sydney once his sentence was completed. Hope, effort and luck enabled thousands of emancipists to make a second start in life better than anything that they had known in their previous British existence. The difference was biggest of all for unskilled workers whose chances in England had been nil. The native-born Australians did not look like their parents and grandparents, those dark and often stunted emanations of the English slums and mills. As children, they had been well, if plainly fed, cradled in sunshine, and they grew into tall, stringy cornstalks, like the Americans, the resident naval surgeon Dr. Peter Cunningham remarked in the 1820s, generally remarkable for that Gothic peculiarity of fair hair and blue eyes. They did not have the typically apple-red cheeks which, some etymologists think, were the origin of that mysterious and durable Australian slang term for an Englishman, pommy. Their complexion was sallow and they lost their teeth early. They were punctiliously honest and sober, with, quote, an open, manly simplicity of character, little tainted with the vices so prominent among their parents, unquote. The men were very clannish. Mateship and class solidarity were absolutely fundamental to their values. They were great street fighters, one in, all in. If a soldier quarrels with one, said Cunningham, the whole hive sally to his aid, and often they have turned out at Christmas time and beat the redcoats fairly back into their barracks. The currency lasses tended to be gauche, pretty, credulous, sexually precocious, since virginity had no special value for the lower classes on the marriage market of penal Australia, but astute in improving their lot through matrimony. They married early. They spent a lot of time at the beach and swam like dab chicks. They were, in short, very like their seventh-generation descendants. The currency were also warmly patriotic. You cannot imagine, wrote George Thomas Boys, the sensitive and irritable colonial diarist from Van Diemen's Land to his wife Mary in far-off England in October 1831, such a beautiful race as the rising generation in this colony. As they grow up, they think nothing of England and can't bear the idea of going there. It's extraordinary the passionate love they have for the country of their birth. There is a degree of liberty here which you can hardly imagine on your side of the equator. The whole country round, mountains and valleys, rock glens, rivers, woods, seems to be their own domain. They shoot, ride, fish, go bivouacking in the woods, hunt possums and kangaroos, catch and train parrots. They are, in short, as free as the birds of the air and the natives of the forests. They are also connoisseurs in horses, cattle, sheep, pigs and wool. And this they all understand before they can speak that 2 and 2 make 4. This would become a common theme of visitors. In the midst of all the constraints of a penal colony, the native-born had developed for themselves a sense of physical liberty and kinship with the landscape. Like Australians in the 1950s, accepting all manner of censorship and excess police power, but feeling like the freest people on earth because they could go surfing at lunchtime.
But the reputation of Australia as a place of terror was not unearned. And the most hideous outpost of cruelty and torment was Van Diemen's Land, the island south of Melbourne, now called Tasmania.
In convict law, Van Diemen's Land always had the worst reputation for severity. Its name induced a frisson that later became integral to Australian culture, and earlier ballads refer to it with a kind of passive dread lacking in the more defiant convict songs of New South Wales. Van Diemen's Land was the very quintessence of punishment. As one ballad ran, the very day we landed upon the fatal shore, the planters they stood round us, full 20 score or more. They ranked us up like horses and sold us out of hand. They roped us to the plough, brave boys, to plough Van Diemen's Land. The reputation of Van Diemen's Land as the convict's hell was gradually acquired. At first the place seemed equally miserable for bond and free, in the way that any new Australian settlement did, coarse, dangerous, and plagued by shortages. Its reputation for severity began modestly with Lieutenant Governor Thomas Davey, 1758 to 1823, who ran Van Diemen's Land from 1813 to 1816. William Sorrell, Davy's successor, seemed like an ideal choice to run a fractious place like this, with its bloody-minded population and long delays in orders. Under his rule, the free population of Van Diemen's Land rose significantly. This meant an enormous proportional increase in the convict population. New means of terror had to be devised to keep convicts docile, and Sorel came up with an effective one. In 1821, he founded a small penal station at McQuary Harbor on the west coast of Tasmania as what he called a place of ultra-banishment and punishment for convicts who had committed second crimes in the colony and appeared to be turning into bushrangers. For 10 years, this would be the worst spot in the English-speaking world. As you approach McQuary Harbor, sea and land curve away to port in a dazzle of white light, diffused through the haze of the incessantly beating ocean. All is sandbank and shallow. The beach that stretches to the northern horizon is dotted with wreckage, the impartial boneyard of ships and whales. No one has ever lived there, or ever will. To starboard, there is a sharp jumble of rocks. To enter the harbour, you must steer between this headland and another rock, Entrance Island, that marks the southern tip of the sandbars. There is no more than 50 yards between them, and at full tidal flow the neck of water has a glossy, swollen look, ominous to seafarers. McQuary Harbor is one of the few large bodies of tidal water in the world, covering some 150 square miles with a bottleneck entrance that faces west. Moreover, it looks directly into the roaring Forties. The prevailing winds are northwesterly, and the waves of the Southern Ocean have the entire circumference of the world in which to build their energy before they crash on this pitiless coast. And so, when tide sets against wind and millions of tons of water a minute come boiling through the entrance, frightful seas rise. Worse, there is a sandbar dead across the entrance with only 11 feet of water over it at spring tide. For these and other reasons, the place is called Hell's Gates. It was the first thing that Irish and English convicts saw when their transport ship sailed in 160 years ago. Lieutenant Governor Sorel made no bones about the purpose of McQuary Harbor. He commissioned its first commandant, Lieutenant John Cuthbertson of the 40th Regiment, with powers as magistrate and justice of the peace, so that he could hear and determine all charges against convicts and punish them with solitary confinement up to 14 days and floggings not in excess of 100 lashes. The place, he wrote, was for the most disorderly and irreclaimable convicts, and the system must be strict and uniform. You will consider, he wrote in his standing orders, that the constant, active, unremitting employment of every individual in very hard labour is the grand and main design of your settlement. The convicts must dread the very idea of being sent there. You must find work and labour, even if it consists in opening cavities and filling them up again. Prisoners upon trial declared that they would rather suffer death than be sent back to McQuary Harbour, and it is the feeling that I am most anxious to be kept alive. To achieve this grand and main design, the McQuary Harbour convicts would be loaded at Hobart into ships without bunks or hammocks. They had to sprawl as best they could on the stone ballast in the hold. The logging of trees was the economic purpose of the settlement, and before the convicts arrived, no man had ever touched them. The most prized kind was the Huon pine, which grew in great stands along the Gordon River. They attained a height of 70 feet and a circumference of 15, and some of them had been saplings when Augustus Caesar was a child. Huon pine was the best ship's timber on earth, springy, close-grained, easy to work, and so rot-proof that there are still Huon trunks felled by convicts in the 1820s and bearing their axe marks lying intact along the shores of McQuary Harbour today. In 1 year, 2,869 of these trunks were felled, sawn up and loaded for transport to Hobart. There were other valuable trees as well. Lightwood, a lovely semi-hard timber that worked like walnut and had the grain and figure of Spanish mahogany, much prized by colonial shipwrights. Celery-top pine, good for masts and spars, and myrtle, whose wood resembled beech and was used by wheelwrights. The prisoners were quartered on an island in the middle of the harbour, known as Sarah Island. Of all the sites that could have been chosen for a settlement at McQuary Harbour, this was the most windswept and barren. Even the water and firewood had to come by boat from the mainland. But it was also the most secure. At 6 a.m, the convicts were herded into boats and ferried to the mainland to cut timber. The settlement had no draft animals because horses and bullocks rarely survived the voyage from Hobart, and in any case there was not enough grass there to feed them. So the ponderous trunks, some of them weighing 12 tons, had to be hauled down a crude corduroy slipway of logs known as a pine road, laid on the forest floor. At the tide line, the logs, sometimes 100 at a time, were chained together in rafts and towed behind whaleboats across the harbour to the saw pits. When they got the raft back to Sarah Island, the worst part of the prisoners' work began, grappling the logs ashore with handspikes, struggling for hours up to their waists in icy water. The convicts' daily ration for this was 1 pound of meat, 1¼ pounds of bread, 4 ounces of oatmeal or hominy, and some salt. The meat was brine-cured pork or beef, 2 or 3 years old. The surgeon noted that it often had to be destroyed as being too bad for the convicts to consume, and that in his own 18 months at McQuary Harbor, he himself had eaten fresh meat no more than 6 times. Such was light punishment, routine at McQuary Harbor. If a convict was balky or insolent, he would be deprived of meat and forced to perform the same work on a protein-free diet. That was the second grade of punishment, and the third was to be ironed with clumsy leg fetters weighing 12, 18 or up to 45 pounds, riveted around his ankles and linked by a chain. An ironed man was issued leather gaiters to keep the basils or rings from wearing through his flesh. Before long, however, the wet chafing of the iron and the stiff hide started ulcers and scraped their ankles down to the bone. By far the worst work was driving piles under water and in chains for the slipways. If that did not break a man down, he could be left overnight on tiny Grummet Island, 1/2 mile off Sarah Island. According to a convict named Davies, who spent several years at McQuary Harbor, it was a perpendicular rock 50 feet above the level of the sea, about 40 yards long and 8 wide. A rude stair in the cliffs is the only road to a truly wretched barracks built with boards and shingles, the timber quite green, into which 79 of us were often confined in so crowded a state as to be scarcely able to lay down on our sides. To lay on our backs was out of the question. To sleep on this rock, in Surgeon Barnes's view, was very severe indeed, although it was considered a minor punishment. No convict could land on Grummet Island without being soaked, so he had to sleep either naked or in wet clothes without fire or blankets. Half-starved, chilled to the bone, forced to labour 12 hours a day in winter and 16 in summer, sleeping on a wet rock under the driving rain squalls of the Southern Ocean, aching with rheumatism and stinking from dysentery, afflicted by saltwater boils and scurvy, some convicts nevertheless remained defiant. Hence flogging was a daily event, and Davies noted down the sentences handed out in his time by Cuthbertson: "The most inhuman tyrant the world ever produced, I think, since the reign of Nero. Oppression and tyranny was his motto. He had neither justice nor compassion for the naked, starved and wretched, and humanity was a virtue he did not acknowledge to us." Neglect of work got 25 lashes, insolence 25. Losing an item from one's slops, the cotton duck government issue work clothes, meant 50 lashes and 3 months in irons, even if the garment had been stolen by another prisoner. Tools in that remote settlement were irreplaceable, and so 50 lashes and 3 months in irons were meted out to anyone who broke a saw, an axe, a spade, an oar, or any other instrument. For robbing the stores or attempting to escape or striking an overseer, a convict got 100 lashes and 6 months in irons. Davies' manuscript gives a vivid picture of this daily blood ritual. "The cats and the way that they were made and used," he wrote, "were the most dreadful things that can be thought of. They had 9 tails, or rather thongs, each 4 feet long, just 3 times the thickness of the Hobart Town cats. Consequently, it took 3 pair of regulation cat o' 9 tails to make one at this settlement. Each tail had on it 7 overhand knots and was whipped, some with wire ends and some with waxed ends. It was left to the decision of the commandant which should be used. The place of punishment was a low point almost level with the sea, and just above high water mark was a planked gangway 100 yards long. By the side of it in the centre stands the triangles to which a man is tied with his side towards the platform on which the commandant and the doctor walked, so that they could see the man's face and back alternately. It was their custom to walk 100 yards between each lash. Consequently, those who received 100 lashes, we were tied up from 1 hour to 1 hour and a quarter, and the moment it was over, unless it were at the meal hours or at nights, he was immediately sent to work, his back like bullock's liver, and most likely his shoes full of blood, and not permitted to go to the hospital until next morning, when his back would be washed by the doctor's mate, and a little hog's lard would be spread on it with a piece of tow, and so off to work. And it often happened that the same man would be flogged the following day for neglect of work. On the average, over the 5 years 1822 to 1826, there were 245 prisoners at McQuary Harbor. Of these, 7 men in 10 were flogged for various offences, mainly rebelliousness, insolence, or refusal to work. In that period, the scourgers inflicted a total of 33,723 lashes, 6,744 per year, meaning a little over 40 per man, each stroke meticulously noted in the commandant's ledger. Convicts distrusted one another because the system was astute enough to use convict guards. All the constables at McQuary Harbour were convicts pressed into service by the military commandant. So were the floggers, the chief constable and the chain gang overseers. The result, it was said, was the most tyrannical system that can be imagined. If a convict constable failed to report some insubordination, word of his cover-up would usually get back to the military command and he would be flogged. If he did report it, and the disobedient convict was flogged, the other prisoners would hate him all the more. The worst thing the military could do to a convict constable, therefore, was to strip him of his rank and throw him back unprotected among the prisoners. To survive at all, the constables had to ride an ascending spiral of vigilance and brutality, and the taste of arbitrary power was an elixir to men who had lost every other source of self-esteem. Prisoners could go to extreme lengths to get away from McQuary Harbour, even for a little while. For example, 2 men would arrange for one to gash the other with an axe or a hoe. The victim would then swear out a charge, and other convicts would step forward as witnesses. Since there was no court at McQuary Harbour, they would all have to be shipped back to Hobart for trial. In court, their testimony would become vague and contradictory, and in the fog of lies, the case would have to be dismissed. Other prisoners would simply murder an overseer or a prisoner so that they could be hanged in Hobart. Thomas Lempriere, who worked for a time as storekeeper in the commissary at McQuary Harbour, described how one such man by the name of Trenham had reasoned this out. Trenham stabbed a fellow prisoner on Grummet Island and was in jail awaiting transfer to Hobart and the gallows. Why, the chaplain asked, had he done it? Because he was tired of his life, Trenham answered, and hoped to hang. Then why did he not drown himself, instead of murdering a fellow creature? Oh, replied the convict, the case is quite different. If I kill myself, I shall immediately descend to the bottomless pit. But if I kill another, I would be sent to Hobart Town and tried for my life. And if found guilty, the parson would attend me, and then I would be sure of going to heaven. He was asked if he had any animosity towards his victim. He replied, no. Would he have killed any of the officers? Certainly, if they'd given him the same chance. Would he have killed his interrogator, the chaplain? Oh yes, as soon as anyone else. Such bizarre events became so common that the commandant, with the permission of the lieutenant governor, ordered a public hanging at McQuary Harbour. The gallows was raised, the felons were all mustered, and the 3 condemned prisoners were marched forth, but, alas for the majesty of law and the moral power of the spectacle, their execution, wrote John Barnes, the surgeon, produced a feeling, I should say, of the most disgusting description. So buoyant were the feelings of the men who were about to be executed, and so little did they seem to care about it, that they kicked their shoes off among the crowd as they were about to be executed, in order, as the term expressed by them was, that they might die game. It seemed to me more like a parting of friends who were going on a distant journey on land than of individuals who were about to separate from each other forever. And the expressions used on that occasion were "Goodbye, Bob," and "Goodbye, Jack," and expressions of that kind among those in the crowd to those who were about to be executed.
In 1825, Van Diemen's Land became a separate colony under the control of Sir George Arthur, a military man who believed it his duty to make men moral. He created a police state designed to close all loopholes in the convict system. He kept detailed records and monitored the movements of virtually everyone under his command. Arthur's rigid system of graded punishments and his attempts to control settler and convict alike led to open criticism in the press. Yet Arthur survived these attacks with his power undiminished. he went on to establish a second isolated penal colony, Port Arthur, and he ended the long-standing guerrilla war between whites and blacks by launching an unprecedented wave of genocide against the Aborigines. Succeeding governors and commandants maintained and refined the institutionalized brutality of the isolated settlements like McQuary Harbor and Port Arthur on the principle that the horror of the punishment would deter criminals. They were wrong. In England, as methods of criminal detection improved and economic conditions worsened, the number of transported men and women increased. Penal settlements metastasized into other hamlets of punishment: Newcastle, Port Macquarie, Moreton Bay, and the infamous Norfolk Island. Norfolk Island, 1,000 miles to the east of Botany Bay, had been briefly settled and then abandoned in 1813. In 1824, it was reopened to provide the would-be criminal a fearsome vision of a place of ultimate terror. To achieve this vision, its commandant would be endowed with unprecedented power. In 1829, Norfolk Island's first long-term commandant arrived, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrisett. A career officer empowered with undreamed-of authority, he set out to create his own version of ultimate terror. During his sadistic tenure, the convicts on Norfolk Island suffered a life of unparalleled misery.
The decisive way out of this misery was suicide. If it had ever once entered my mind that a self-murderer could obtain salvation, I would not have seen a 10th part of the misery that I underwent, wrote Lawrence Frayne, the only convict to leave a first-hand account of life under Morrisett. But religious instruction was so basic to the rearing of many convicts, especially Irishmen like Frayne, that suicide was unthinkable. By killing themselves, they believed that they would exchange the pains of the island for a real and eternal hell from which there would be no release. And so most of the prisoners who felt, like Frayne, heartsick of my own existence, still could not bring themselves to what he called that climax of human depravity, to take away my own life with my own hands. They were caught between God and the commandant, condemned by their will to survive. Yet in Morissett's time a remarkable usage emerged on Norfolk Island. It turned suicide into an act of solidarity, not of solipsism and despair. A group of convicts would choose 2 men by drawing straws, one to die, the other to kill him, and others would stand by as witnesses. There being no judge to try capital offences on Norfolk Island, the killer and witnesses would have to be sent to Sydney for trial, an inconvenience for the authorities, but a boon to the prisoners who yearned for the meagre relief of getting away from the ocean hell, if only to a gallows on the mainland. And in Sydney there was some slight chance of escape. The victim could not choose himself. Everyone in the group apparently had to be equally ready to die, and the benefits of his death had to be shared equally by all survivors. Suicide by lottery thus acquired a Roman tinge of disinterestedness. One full account of such a ritual survives. It was written by Captain Foster Fyans, Morissett's second-in-command, who had questioned the survivors in the event. One day in 1832 or 3, a gang of 16 convicts was marched out from the Kingston barracks to labour on a road. At the sight, they seized and manacled their overseer to the only outsider in the gang, an unnamed Jewish prisoner, remarking that Jews are not to be trusted. The gang leader, Fitzgerald, produced a makeshift knife and harangued his mates. "Now, gentlemen, to business. You all know the plot. Is anyone against it? Nil. I have 16 straws in my fist. The long straw will gain a prize, and the short will be his mate. And here is as good a piece of hoop iron as any on this island, and what's more, it would shave a bishop. Fair play is a jewel. Who draws for Lazarus?" "Oh, my God Almighty, spare my life, gentlemen," cried the poor Jew. "Fair play is a jewel. Come, Mr. Jew, you shall have first prize. So help me God, spare me." The Jew fainted when all cried out for the overseer to choose for him. With some difficulty he was forced by kicks and threats to draw. He did so, the others following, when Fitzgerald was left with the longest straw and the other with the shortest. Either were to suffer a cruel death on the spot, Fyans remarked. The long straw now drew against the short for who was to suffer, and Fitzgerald himself won, and made a brief speech to his comrades, which Fyans reports as follows. I'm sorry, boys, that I'm leaving you, but I am not the man either to preach or to tell a lie. You'll have fine fun before you going to Sydney, and a chance of giving 'em the go-by. Think of me, boys, you'll all get off alone. Tell old Dowling the judge that it's me own free will, and that Pat Larkins sticks me. I'm all ready now. Come on, my hearties. Quick, please yourself, and give me as little pain as you can." At this, Pat Larkins drove the hoop-iron knife into Fitzgerald's stomach up to his fist and disembowelled him there in the dust of the road. The gang ran away. The Jew and the overseer found the key to their handcuffs in the dying man's pocket and freed themselves, and after 2 days of anguish, Fitzgerald expired in the hospital. Later, most of the gang were shipped back to Sydney for trial. Clearly, from his account, Fynes was impressed by the stoic courage of Fitzgerald's death. He was a soldier and could respect the clan-bound toughness of such men.
Once the last avenue to possible escape was closed in 1833, when capital crimes could be tried on Norfolk Island, the convicts' only remaining hope lay in rebellion. The Norfolk Island Mutiny of 1834 was an ill-planned, badly coordinated failure. Hideous reprisals followed for months. After a trial resulting in 30 capital convictions, 16 of the condemned men had their sentences commuted to hard labor on the grounds that conditions on Norfolk Island had invited rebellion. The 14 who were to die thanked God. The 16 who were to live wept bitterly. Leadership changed, but fundamental assumptions remained the same.
Labour was aimed at punishment, not at production. The conditions robbed exertion of its meaning. No ploughs were allowed on Norfolk Island, and so all the convicts responded with the government's stroke. Everything went at a snail's pace despite the threat of the lash, and the result was an almost parodical inefficiency. The harder the overseers and the guards pushed, the more the convicts malingered. They feigned sickness or induced it, poisoning themselves with lye and nightshade berries. They raised ulcers with manchineel juice or got friends to cut their toes off with a hoe. Malingerers were flogged, but sometimes sick men came up for a flogging too and died. Deranged by cruelty and misery, some men would opt for a lifetime at the bottom of the carceral heap by blinding themselves. Thus, they reasoned, they could be left alone. This was the passive end of the moral anarchy that pervaded Norfolk Island. Its active end was the demonising of prisoners by an authority whose own capricious brutality could offer no road back from their abasement. For, as Lawrence Frayne put it in his memoirs, "If you endeavour to take out of a prisoner that manly confidence which ought to be cherished in every civilised human being, you then begin the work of demoralisation, and it will end in the very dregs of debasement and an insensibility to every species of integrity and decency, and eradicate every right feeling in the human breast. You make him regardless of himself and fearless as to the consequences of doing wrong to others. There is a certain pitch to which you can work upon a man to bring him to bear, but exceed that and you make him reckless. Begin to treat him as beneath your care and notice, and they then think that you put God, his laws, his omniscience, his providence, as though they were mere nominal attributes and not virtual and real." Norfolk Island, Frayne argued, wrecked the social contract. Authority was supposed, by sinner and saint alike, to draw its value from its mirroring power, its role as a reflected sign of God's mercy as well as his justice. Bad authority strips all men of hope by showing them a cracked glass, a different truth about hierarchies. Missionaries on Norfolk Island were struck by the state of mind that oppression bred in the convicts. Norfolk Island resembled Sodom sexually, but the likeness went deeper. It seemed to have become the epitome of all inversions, to breed that final hopelessness held by theologians to be the worst torment of hell, a place where, in those words of Milton used by Edmund Burke in an early Commons debate on transportation, all life dies and all death lives. It completed the myth of the Antipodean inversion of nature by projecting it onto human society. Within its unspeakable microcosm, language itself was reversed. "So corrupt was their most ordinary language," wrote one missionary, "that, in their dialect, evil was literally called good, and good evil. The well-disposed man was branded wicked, while the leader in monstrous vice was styled virtuous. The human heart seemed here inverted, and the very conscience reversed."
On the mainland, there was little desire to alter the status quo of Norfolk Island. But from 1835 on, England heard a growing chorus of protest against transportation. The man whose voice initiated the downfall of the system of transportation was Captain Alexander McConaughey, who went to Van Diemen's Land as private secretary to the governor, Sir John Franklin. McConaughey, a Navy man, had been a POW of the French under Napoleon. He was the only major official of the transportation system to have spent time behind bars. He never forgot it.
Released from prison by Napoleon's abdication in 1814, McConaughey joined the English Navy in its war against America. He was promoted to commander just before peace was signed in 1815. For the next 13 years he lived in Edinburgh, studying geography and geopolitics and writing lengthy tracts on Pacific colonisation and steam navigation. His interest in the Pacific at this point was rather abstract, as he'd never been there. He married in 1822, moved to London in 28, and in 1830 became the first professor of geography at University College, London, and the first secretary of the newly formed Royal Geographical Society. From these chair-bound labours he was plucked in 1837 by Sir John Franklin, who offered him the chance to see the Pacific and England's remotest colony at first hand. McConaughey's acquaintances in the Society for the Improvement of Prison Discipline asked him, since there was such a dearth of first-hand observers with no vested interest in the system, to complete for them a 67-point questionnaire on the treatment of prisoners in Van Diemen's Land. The Scot had no theories about the system and no prior acquaintance with it. He seemed quite unprejudiced. He agreed to make the report, a task to which neither Franklin nor Sir Henry George Grey, the Under-Secretary for the Colonies, had any objection so long as he sent it through Franklin to Grey and not directly to the Society. The system, McConaughey thought, debased free and bond alike, producing the fretfulness of temper which so peculiarly characterises the intercourse of society in our penal colonies. Most of his report consisted of social impressions and moral lucubrations, but it had a hard core of fact. McConaughey found little to commend in Arthur's graded assignment system. It did not reform convicts, it bred social malaise and blunted the moral sense. It destroys both soul and body, both master and man, he said, both colonial character and, I may almost say, national reputation. The convicts, he movingly argued, have their claims on us also, only the more sacred because they are helpless in our hands. We condemn them for our own advantage. We have no right to cast them away altogether. Even their physical suffering should be in moderation, and the moral pain we must and ought to inflict with it should be carefully framed so as, if possible, to reform and not necessarily to pervert them. The iron should enter both soul and body, but not so as utterly to sear and harden them. McConaughey gave this report to Franklin, who asked him to tone down some of the sharper criticisms, and he did so. Franklin sent the edited version to the main officials of the colony. Alexander Cheney, who had aided McConaughey's research, supported it. The others vehemently disagreed, and Franklin sent their minutes, one of his own and McConaughey's rebuttal of it, along with the report itself, to Lord Glenelg. For fear that this mass of paper, now running to several hundred pages, should perish in the Colonial Office from its own intrinsic gravity, as he put it, McConaughey wrote a separate summary of his case and sent it to Lord Grey, as he had promised to do, but with a covering note asking him, if he thought fit, to show it to Lord John Russell. Russell was the Home Secretary in charge of the British penal system. Franklin did not read this abstract from McConaughey, but he thought he knew what was in it. He hesitated to pass it on, but he gave in to McConaughey's pleas. He wrote a covering note to Grey, urging him not to send any material to the Society for the Improvement of Prison Discipline before it was thoroughly vetted by the Colonial Office, lest it give pain to many respectable inhabitants here. Thus, two reports on Van Diemen's Land, the long revised one Franklin had read, and the more pungent précis that he had not, reached London by the same ship in February 1838. Grey read the précis, and on March 5 he passed it along to Lord Russell. If any moment can be said to mark the peak and the incipient decline of transportation to Australia, this innocuous act marked it. For what McConaughey did not know and could not have known due to the long delays in official communication between England and Australia was that Russell, an ardent critic of transportation, had just been appointed a member of a parliamentary select committee under the chairmanship of the even more dogmatically anti-transportationist Sir William Molesworth to inquire into the workings of the system. The Molesworth Committee had been convened in April 1837 when McConaughey's dispatches were on the water. At that point, its members knew no more about McConaughey's criticisms than McConaughey knew about the committee. But Russell wanted ammunition. He sent McConaughey's précis straight to the government printer for publication. Thus a private memo entered the public official record. To back it up, Russell had the whole text and minutes of the longer report, as approved by Franklin, published a month later. Both documents created a sensation in the English press, but it was nothing compared to the hullabaloo that the English papers touched off in Van Diemen's Land 6 months later in September 1838 when they reached Hobart. All of a sudden, the good citizens of Van Diemen's Land found themselves vilified in official parliamentary print as callous slave owners, rulers of a petty kingdom raised on the exploited backs of convicts. Everyone who had ever had a convict assigned to him could now hate McConaughey, who, so the Hobart version went, had gone behind Franklin's back and smuggled his foul libels to England under the guise of official correspondence. The McConaugheys were ostracised. "We see few and go nowhere," Mrs. McConaughey wrote. "Alexander is like a lion at bay, deafened by the barking and yelping of the curs about him, but in no other ways stirred from his steady honesty of purpose. Alas, alas, I've always looked forward to trials and difficulties, mystifications of every description, but no imagination could have realised the continued tissue of falsehood, suspicion, and unworthy accusations continually poured forth." All this only stiffened McConaughey's fibre. He had at last found his mission in life. "The cause has got me complete," he wrote to London. "I will go the whole hog on it. I will neither acquiesce in the moral destruction of so many of my fellow beings, nor in misrepresentations made of myself, without doing everything that may be necessary or possible to assist both." He felt the deck lifting under his feet. The Molesworth Committee had brought in its verdict of guilty on transportation. Public opinion in England was changing. Despite his isolation in Hobart, McConaughey had found the allies that he needed 14,000 miles away, at the head of the system, among English Whigs whose slanting of the evidence had made the findings of the Molesworth Committee a foregone conclusion. The Molesworth Committee declared that its purpose was to inquire into the system of transportation, its efficacy as a punishment, its influence on the moral state of society in the penal colonies, and how far it is susceptible of improvement. It began its hearings in 1837 and laid its final report before the Commons in August 1838. The committee claimed to be an objective tribunal. It was in fact a heavily biased show trial designed to present a catalogue of antipodean horrors conducted by Whigs against a system that they were already planning to jettison. Its real movers were the Home Secretary, Lord John Russell, and the Under Secretary for the Colonies, Lord Grey, in consultation with the Colonial Office. Between them, Russell and Lord Glenelg had decided to abolish assignment and step up free immigration to Australia before the Molesworth Committee had heard a single witness. So the committee was formed to dramatise the need for a decision that had already been taken.
The Molesworth Committee criticized the randomness of punishment, its inefficiency at deterring crime, and its efficiency in further corrupting those who are punished. Any economic benefits were deemed to be short-term. The committee concluded that the only course possible for the further settlement of Australia was free emigration.
The colonists feared, with reason, that by the time the Whigs had finished libelling their morals, no one would want to come to Australia anyway, and the colony would then have neither convict labour nor free. To them, the report was a stunning parental rejection. They had posited their social self-esteem on a rigid class barrier between themselves and the convicts. Even the currency had done this. Now the report claimed that crime was increasing faster than population, and it referred to a progressive demoralisation both of the bond and of the free inhabitants. Clearly, in English eyes, there was not much to choose between them. No wonder that the exclusives, who had always insisted that the offspring of convicts bore a hereditary stain which had not touched their own lineage, reproached Mother England in bewildered denials and Oedipal tantrums, and that they resolved to tighten the class line between convicts and respectables in New South Wales. Meanwhile, the Sydney press, which until 1838 had kept up a drumfire of scare stories about a growing crime wave in New South Wales, suddenly changed its tune. The very idea of a crime wave became, in local Tory eyes, a monstrous caricature sketched by English Whigs. The report had placed the colonists in exactly the double bind that defines a colonial mentality. Many of them wanted to be more English than the English themselves. They needed the approval of the implacable parent. Instead, Molesworth gave them pages of condescending priggery about their ineradicable stain. Once the fuss over the Molesworth report had died down, however, the end of transportation and assignment in New South Wales came smoothly, without much political or economic strain. Even before the report hit the colony, the instructions from Downing Street were to wind down assignment and coerce convicts in government labour gangs instead. In October 1838, Governor Sir George Gipps, a gallant veteran of the Peninsular War and a strikingly prudent and humane man, did all he could to ease the transition of the labour supply from convicts to emigrants. The bounty system, approved by the Colonial Office in 1837, helped a lot. It gave £30 to every able-bodied migrant couple under the age of 30 and £5 to each of their children. Single men, sponsored by settlers, were underwritten to the tune of £10 each, and respectable spinsters between the ages of 15 and 30, if they came under the protection of a married couple, got £15 each. Before long, 18,000 free immigrants had arrived in New South Wales on the bounty system and over 40,000 on their own initiative. This was more than enough to fill the gap in the labour supply. The Eden 1, the last convict transport to arrive in New South Wales under the old system, dropped her 269 male prisoners at Sydney Cove on November the 18th, 1840.
In the same year, Alexander McConaughey became commandant of Norfolk Island, where he was allowed to institute his program focusing on reform rather than punishment. McConaughey's system of positive incentives was remarkably successful. Of 920 twice-convicted prisoners discharged to Sydney, only 2% backslid and were convicted again. But despite his success, McConaughey was brought down 3 years later by a mainland faction that wanted a place of ultimate terror restored to the system. Official terror once more reigned on Norfolk Island, climaxing with the appointment of John Price as commandant. Price was beaten to death by prisoners after nearly 10 years of unceasing brutality. Once again, sentiment in England and the colony rose against transportation to any of the remaining penal colonies, including Van Diemen's Land and Norfolk Island. The system was inexorably dismantled.
Price's reign on Norfolk Island had been the last paroxysm of the system's cruelty, a nightmare sweated out by a dying organism. The end of transportation was reached through a cumbersome accommodation between morally indignant colonials who could not make good on their threats and imperialists who felt weary of an obsolete penal system and yet could not cancel it at a stroke for fear of seeming malleable to popular Australian pressure. Anti-transportation views by the late 1840s were a commonplace of every pulpit sermon and most political meetings. The same was true in Melbourne and in Van Diemen's Land, the last remaining site of transportation, where in 1849 an anti-transportation league was formed under the leadership of the island's leading publisher, Henry Dowling, the landowner Richard Dry, and John West, a fervently eloquent Congregationalist minister who, when not inveighing against the system from lecture halls and pulpits throughout the island, wrote the first and, for many years, the best history of Van Diemen's Land. The League's work played a large part, larger than it is usually credited with, in killing transportation to Van Diemen's Land. But what finished it off was Lord Grey's retirement from the Colonial Office and the discovery of gold in Australia. Whatever the justice of Grey's desire to maintain the option of transportation, and justice it had, for all its lack of appeal to colonial feelings, his hopes were overridden by the gold discoveries of 1851. Gold was the mineral that put an end to transportation because its discovery plucked off the last rags of terror that clung to the name of Australia. With a quarter of Britain, from navvies to viscounts, clamouring now for tickets to the southern goldfields, who was to think that a trip to El Dorado at government expense constituted a fearful punishment, especially if, as rumour had it, convicts got a conditional pardon as soon as they stepped ashore at Hobart? As Governor-General Fitzroy remarked, few English criminals would not regard a free passage to the goldfields via Hobart Town as a great boon. There were still people who thought of convict labour as an economic panacea, but they were mostly cranks. The English press, led by the Times, was by now solidly against transportation. And indeed, transportation to Van Diemen's Land did come to an end. The last convict transport, the 630-ton ship St. Vincent, had sailed for Hobart on November 27, 1852. Van Diemen's Land officially ceased to be a penal colony 13 months later, and with a collective whistle of relief, its citizens proceeded, as they hoped, to get rid of the demonic image of their island once and for all by giving it the name of its Dutch discoverer, Tasmania, for the navigator Abel Tasman. The formal end of transportation to Van Diemen's Land came with the Jubilee of the colony, August 10, 1853, the 50th anniversary of the day that the first camps were pitched at Risdon Cove. It provoked a flutter of doggerel in the press. An editor in Launceston composed a pastiche to the tune of God Save the Queen. Thousands of copies were printed on a press which, mounted on a bunting-line cart, was drawn in procession through the town. Broken Tasmania's chain, washed out that hated stain, ended the strife and pain, blessed Jubilee, it ran in part. The cart, symbol of the power of the colonial press in its struggles for abolition against foot-dragging officialdom, was preceded by groups separated by bannermen, members of the Legislative Council, the Mayor, the Corporation, a phalanx of native-born colonists marching four abreast, public societies with their regalia, and the hope and staff of the colony, its children. They marched under a triumphal arch of pasteboard, decked with fronds of native wattle, to the sprightly tooting of a brass band. The long anguish of the system was now over. What had it achieved? It might be gratifying to claim that it had failed altogether, that this not-so-small, not-so-primitive ancestor of the Gulag deterred no one in Britain and reformed no one in Australia, that as a penal system it was quite unproductive, a botched act of sublimation. But for all its flaws, and one cannot imagine any prison system without defects, the assignment system in Australia was by far the most successful form of penal rehabilitation that had ever been tried in English, American, or indeed European history. In assessing it, one must remember that many of its critics, in dwelling on the cruelties and injustices that took place within it, were doing so not as objective reporters, but as proponents of rival ideologies of punishment. Every proposed alternative to the assignment system, made in the name of penal utopias, turned out, when tried, to be worse. The assigned man's work was hard, unless he was lucky enough to get work as a domestic servant or a clerk, as many did. But it was not necessarily harder than the kind of work a settler had to do for himself, and to judge by the surviving letters of assigned men who had been rural workers before, it was not worse than the labour of a farmhand in Britain, despite the flies, the snakes and the heat. Enemies of the system got used to calling this work, and the condition of those who did it, slavery. But it was not slavery. The assigned man worked within a vigilantly sustained framework of laws and rights. Some of the masters were cruel, others irresponsible, some exploitative, and a few openly sadistic. But most were none of these things. They were hard, imperfect men struggling to wrest survival, or something more, from the stingy Australian earth, and many of them had been transported themselves. Few of them perceived their assigned servants as a seigneur did a serf, and those who wished to were frustrated by the law. Assignment had been the early form of today's open prison. Instead of herding men together in gangs, in which bad apples automatically dominated, assignment dispersed them throughout the bush and kept them in working contact with the free. It fostered self-reliance, taught them jobs, and rewarded them for doing them right. It put them on the frontier and did not leave them to rot. Of course, one can overrate the virtues of assignment, but as a rough and ready way of getting convicts back into society as self-sustaining workers, it was better than the soul-crushing totalitarian machinery of alternative proposals like the penitentiary. The convict past is a shadowy behavioural catch-all today. Thus it made Australians cynical about authority, or else it made them conformists. As so many Australians are conformist sceptics, the convict legacy is seen to be all the more pervasive. Perhaps there are roots of social conduct that wind obscurely back to the convict era, and the familiar Australian habit of cursing authority behind the hand while truckling to its face may well be one of them. It may also be that Australian sexism receives some of its force from the brutal psychic legacy of carceral life. But since the vast majority of European Australians are the descendants either of Anglo-Irish and Scotsmen who arrived after 1850, or of Greeks, Italians, Hungarians, Balts, Poles and Germans who emigrated after 1945, this may be a sterile line of inquiry. Would Australians have done anything differently if their country had not been settled as the jail of infinite space? Certainly they would. They would have remembered more of their own history. The obsessive cultural enterprise of Australians 100 years ago was to forget it entirely, to sublimate it. This affected all Australian culture, from political rhetoric to the perception of space, of landscape itself. Space in America had always been optimistic. The more of it you faced, the freer you were. Go west, young man. In Australian terms, to go west was to die, and space itself was the jail.
Port Arthur clings to the ragged edge of the southeastern Tasmanian coast. It was named by Governor Arthur, who chose the spot as a secondary penal settlement because of its rugged isolation and relative inaccessibility. In the late 19th century, this place of punishment became a tourist attraction.
On fine weekends in the late 1870s and through the 80s, hundreds of trippers would descend on Port Arthur from Hobart in paddle-wheel steamers, shrieking with agitation as they were locked for a few minutes in the pitch-black, stony silence of the dumb cells, chattering happily as their boots crunched through the debris in the empty penitentiary dormitories. Sometimes a visitor would be able to buy a rusty leg ring or a rotted hobnail boot from one of the locals who, now that Port Arthur had been reincorporated as a town, were trickling back to the Tasman Peninsula. The appetite for prison souvenirs had not been lost on a Hobart photographer named John Beattie, who documented the buildings and some of the surviving old hands of Port Arthur and even visited Norfolk Island. He also printed postcards of prison emblems, elaborate still lives of leg irons, cuffs, keys, guards' carbines and paraphernalia from the model prison, surrounded by swags of leaves and wildflowers. It was well that he made such records of the detested past, for not long afterwards the long impending fate of Sodom struck the Tasman Peninsula. First there was an earthquake, and then, in 1897, a bushfire consumed the penal settlement. Many Tasmanians had difficulty concealing their glee and wished only to demolish the ruins. The visitor today, wandering through what remains of the penitentiary with other tourists, can hardly grasp the isolation it once stood for. Perhaps that is easier deduced from nature itself, from the barely penetrable labyrinth of space that England chose as its abode of crime. And to see that, one need only go to the black basalt cliffs that frame the Tasman Peninsula, crawl through the bushes to their unfenced rim, and gaze down on the wide, wrinkled, glimmering sheet of our imprisoning sea.
This has been a Random House Audiobooks presentation.